So the Olmecs are perhaps Mesoamerica's strangest and most fascinating ancient culture. They seem to arrive on the historical timeline being almost a fully fledged and organized civilization, whose artwork and stonemasonry is completely fully formed at the very beginning of its civilization, or at least we don't have much of an archaeological record going back before the time of these gigantic colossal heads. And it's really not just the colossal heads. You have these enormous hexagonal column tombs that are being mined from basalt quarries over 100 kilometers away from their final site, and tons of other megalithic statues as well. We also don't even know what the Olmecs actually called themselves. We only get the name Olmecs or Olmecas from the Aztecs, referring to the people who were living in the Olmec area some 2,000 years later, and it means the rubber people, or people from the rubber region. And so if you've been following this channel for any period of time or seen me on any number of podcasts, you know I'm a huge fan of the Olmecs, and I'm actually working on a book, my first book, covering the Olmecs. And because of that, I get all kinds of recommendations from you guys as to videos that I should watch or react to, and this one in particular caught my attention, and it is Graham Hancock on the Joe Rogan Experience talking about the Olmecs. Now, to see someone with such a big name and such a famous person discussing the Olmecs on such a huge podcast is kind of a rarity. At least the Olmecs don't get that kind of spotlight. I mean, when's the last time you saw an Olmec head featured in a movie? Not very often, if ever. I mean, I don't think I can think of an example. So let's give this video a try, and I'm going to give you my thoughts throughout the course of the video.
Do you have anything in this book about the Olmecs?
No, not really. I mentioned them briefly. I explored the Olmec mystery in considerable depth.
Could you explain that to people that maybe
in Fingerprints of the Gods? Yes. So it's considered to be the earliest high culture of Central America. Everybody's heard about the Aztecs. Everybody's heard about the Maya. But before the Aztecs and before the Maya, there were a culture who are referred to as the Olmecs. Again, we don't know what they called themselves. That's what the Aztecs called them. They called them the Olmecs, and it means the rubber people because that a rubber-producing area of Mexico. They worked in giant megalithic constructions. What they're most famous for is these huge carved human heads, which can be on a scale of up to 20 to 25 tons in weight, and which have curious features which have.
So one thing about this San Lorenzo head, this head right here is like the most iconic head from the Olmec world. When you walk around to the back side of that head, I was there just a couple of months ago. When you walk around to the back side of that head, there's actually a Mesoamerican or maybe even a Maya glyph on the backside, and you don't really see, at least I don't know, people who actually research the Olmecs, you don't really see much in the way of Olmec writing or glyphs. There are some things that we think may be Olmec writing, but and I should preface that this head likely was carved and constructed around or erected around somewhere around 1400 to 1200 BC. So at that period, we see some things later on during the Epi-Olmec period, closer to about 300 BC, that may be Mesoamerican glyphs, but nothing as far back as 1300 BC, 1,000 years before. So on the backside of this head, there is what is very clearly a Maya-looking glyph, but thus far, people who translate Maya glyphs haven't been able to identify this. So it's either some kind of graffiti carving that perhaps a Maya person came later on and carved a glyph into it, or this is a heavily overlooked Olmec glyph on the back of San Lorenzo's most iconic Olmec head.
Been interpreted variously as Polynesian, African, don't look like classic Native American features.
Keep that up.
But one of the things I've realized is that there is no classic Native American feature. That Native Americans are have a very complex genetic story with very many different.
That's so true. So when Graham Hancock wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, which I read, I don't know, 10 years ago, and I read it again more recently, probably about 4 years ago, he theorizes that the Olmec heads have some African features and that they look so much different than the rest of the depictions that we see of Native Americans. But then he says here, I mean, and this is years later after more research has come out, then he says here that what he's learned is that there's a wide plethora, or there's a wide range of what Native Americans look like. And I would actually even get more specific than that. There is a wide range of what Mexicans look like, or people who lived in Mesoamerica. When you're at Mexico City's National Museum of Anthropology, and you go to the Western Mexico section, you see people with high cheekbones, pointed chins, and almost diamond-shaped, very angular jawlines, and they all look like that. Then you go to the Maya region, and you see people who look kind of a bit more like me, like long faces, sort of a long nose, I don't know, high cheekbones. I sort of look like a Maya person. I have a little bit of Yucatec in me, and you can sort of see it in my features from certain angles. But then in the Olmec world, you see people with kind of chubby, fat, round faces with big nose and big lips, and these are commonly interpreted, or at least people like to see them, as being African features. But that's not true at all. People in Veracruz, or I should say indigenous people in Veracruz, don't look like indigenous people that live in the Maya region. They don't look like people who live in Western Mexico. They have their own unique look. And that was never more clear to me than when we walked through the door of the Jalapa Museum, and there was a man there from Veracruz who was he was way over 6 feet tall, but he had a big round face with big lips, a big nose, and he looked exactly like an Olmec head. And I opened the door and I was like, oh, wow, there's an Olmec standing right in front of me. So not only do Native Americans look vastly different as you travel across, I mean, it's obvious that they would look vastly different. They cover 1/2 of the planet. So at least, during the time of pre-Columbus, of course they didn't all look the same. They cover half the planet. It's not like, you wouldn't think that people living on the other half, on the eastern half of the planet, all look the same. So all Native Americans look different, and not only Native Americans, but ancient Mexicans as well, or even people from ancient Mesoamerica.
And we shouldn't be necessarily surprised by the supposedly non-Native American look of these Olmec heads.
What do we think those helmets were that they were wearing?
Nobody knows, because no physical example of such a helmet has ever been found, just like no physical example of an Egyptian pharaoh's crown has ever been found. All we see is the...
Another thing is so the Olmecs, we think, invented the Mesoamerican ball game. And I won't explain the whole ball game, but there's tons of videos that you can go watch and then come back and pick up. These Olmec heads, the helmets that they're wearing, they've never been found. Just like Egyptian headdresses, they've never been found. But the helmets may represent something that very early ball players would have worn. We don't really see these helmets depicted really anywhere else in Mesoamerica, as far as I know.
All we see is the stone reproductions of them.
Do they universally wear these helmets in these stone reproductions?
They pretty much all wear these helmets.
This head is in the Jalapa Museum, I believe, and wow, standing in front of it in person is overwhelming. This is probably the smoothest, most beautiful Olmec head of all of them, I would say.
Helmets in the Olmec stonework. There's another fascinating figure from La Venta, one of the Olmec sites, which is the earliest ever image of a plumed or feathered serpent. The feathered serpent is a famous icon in Central America. Quetzalcoatl, who's the god of peace, the bringer of civilization, who is associated, for example, with the famous pyramid of Kukulkan, which is just another name for Quetzalcoatl at Chichen Itza, where on the spring equinox a shadow effect creates the image of a serpent coiling down the stairway and joining with the carved head of the serpent. There's the image from...
Yeah, so I went and saw this for the first time with NEXT just a couple months ago after I did my Olmec expedition, and it was pretty amazing. So on the spring equinox, the sun is setting in just the right way that a shadow is cast from the corner of the step pyramid, and the shadow that's being cast onto the railway of the stairway going down, it looks like a serpent undulating down the pyramid, and it connects with the serpent head at the bottom. Now, a lot of archaeologists think that this is just an accident and that this was bound to happen if you constructed a pyramid just like this. And it doesn't actually just happen on one day. It happens, I think, over the course of a week or 2 weeks. But when you're there, the environment that's there, and there's thousands of people all cheering when you can see the shadow being projected onto the side of the pyramid, and it looks like the serpent is going down the pyramid. I don't know. It feels intentional to me, but many archaeologists think that this may just be an accident of some kind, that the Maya didn't actually intend for this to happen on purpose. But then again, the Maya were the ancient world's greatest astronomers, and if anybody could do this on purpose, it was absolutely them.
Benta, that's the earliest image of a plumed serpent in the Americas. And sitting in the middle of it, and I made a big deal out of this because I think it is a big deal in Magicians of the Gods, sitting in the middle of it is this human figure who's holding this strange bag in his hand. And it's just a fact that those identical bags are found in ancient Sumer.
So I don't mean to cut him off about the handbag thing, but one thing I want to point out that I've always thought was amazing is look at the aesthetics of the head of that plumed serpent. Now, I don't know. It's hard to say that this is a plumed serpent or a feathered serpent for sure. I mean, it looks like it, and obviously it's similar iconography, and it's also in Mesoamerica, so it seems at the very least likely that this is the first depiction of the feathered serpent. But you can see on his tail, he also has a rattle. And so he's some kind of feathered serpent or dragon with a rattlesnake tail. But if you look at how well it's carved and the aesthetics of it and the proportions, you wonder how many generations does it take for artisans to become that good, and how much lost artwork must there be? Because like I said before, the Olmecs seem to be a fully fledged and fully realized civilization from the beginning of their archaeological record. They are making monuments like this from the very beginning, according to the archaeology that we have. And they're carving it into basalt as well, which is an extremely hard stone. So let's continue.
In the hands of individuals who were considered to be civilization bringers. And they also show up on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe. I call them man bags. And in that case, at Göbekli Tepe, we know they're at least 11,600 years old. So I wonder if we're looking at a sort of badge of office of a group of civilizers who traveled around the world trying to bring back to life a lost...
So they kind of jump through that, where he talks about, he wonders if there's a badge of office of a lost civilization going around the world and bringing some kind of knowledge. It's a big claim, and it's possible to prove, but really difficult to prove as well. And the problem is, okay, so Göbekli Tepe, I think, is right after or right in the middle of this cataclysm, and we may see handbags there as well. We also see them in ancient Mesopotamia, which is some 2,000 to 3,000 years before the time of the Olmecs. We also see these handbags in classic Veracruz, which is around 900 AD. If there's this lost civilization going around and bringing knowledge to people, that must mean that they exist during the time of about, let's call it 1500 BC, when Olmec civilization really begins. So this lost civilization that's moving around bringing knowledge of civilization to different corners of the earth, that means they were doing that contemporaneously with the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom of ancient Egypt, which, I don't know, seems to go against the whole Atlantis idea, because civilization had already kicked off in other areas of the world by then. I mean, I suppose there's an argument that still makes sense, but the civilization bringers, where do they go after 1500 BC? So it's tough to explain these things, although when you look at that monument 19 where he's holding that handbag while being carried inside what is possibly some kind of flying serpent, what do you make of that? And then you see those same kind of handbags in the ancient Middle East, and maybe we see it depicted on Göbekli Tepe, although it's quite different, and I don't think anybody's holding those. What is somebody supposed to make of these monuments? I honestly have no idea. There could be a psychedelic answer of some kind. Perhaps, I mean, we know for a fact that ancient cultures are delving into primitive psychedelics, or I mean, I call them primitive, but they could have been extremely advanced. These guys could have been a great chemist and botanist. Research is just now showing the depth at which the ancient Greek civilization was experimenting with psychedelics, although we've known that for a long time, as well as the Romans, the Egyptians. We know that ancient Americans were doing this too. We know the Aztecs were doing it. Perhaps, rather than there being a physical badge of office traveling around the world, perhaps these ancient civilizations are all tapping into a similar source and somehow having similar epiphanies and seeing similar iconography and producing similar images. I mean, we see ancient patterns. You can look up Greek and Mesoamerican meandering patterns that are basically exactly identical being produced in ancient Greece, the ancient Maya world, ancient Peru, the Zapotec civilization, the Aztec civilization. You can see it in North America in Chaco Canyon. You can see it in ancient Florida. You can see it in the Mississippian cultures. There's some kind of connection here. And maybe it's not a connection between cultures, but perhaps it's more of a connection where all of these civilizations are tapping into a similar source and then producing similar iconography because of that. Maybe that's an explanation.
Did you talk about Quetzalcoatl? What were you about to say?
I can't remember.
Oh.
I'm in California. I've been smoking lots of dope.
We were talking about different things in the Amazon. Should we rewind and figure out what we said?
Yeah, the serpent god you were talking about.
Before Quetzalcoatl, before that. I have another question. The Olmecs, you were talking about the genetics of these people that live in Native Americans, that they vary widely. But the Olmecs seem to have very similar features, the thick lips, the wide noses. Why do we think that is?
Well, this is part of a curious mystery that is not unconnected to the genetic mystery. It's been known by archaeologists for quite a long time that there are anomalous skulls in parts of Brazil, which appear to show very strongly Polynesian or African features, very much like the features that we see on the Olmec heads. And a number of archaeologists who got into trouble with their colleagues for this have used that to argue many years ago, 30, 40 years ago, that the settlement story of the Americas is much more complicated than we've realized. And what the DNA is doing is it's telling us that.
Yeah, I mean, the story of people migrating to the Americas is probably going to be forever evolving, because I think that people were constantly finding some way to be here. I mean, they thought that civilization in the Americas wasn't really kicking off until maybe 1500 BC during the time of the Olmecs, and that people weren't arriving in South America until, I don't know, around 10,000 years ago. But now we're finding evidence of 30,000-year-old campsites in southeastern Brazil, I believe, near the coast. And so how do you make that jump all the way from crossing over from Asia down into Alaska, North America, to the southeast side of Brazil in the Amazon? I don't know. But one of the things that I'm writing about right now is I'm researching ancient Olmec rafts. And while I'm researching that, I'm also researching ancient Colombian, Ecuadorian, and Peruvian balsa rafts that the Spanish navigators encountered leading into Pizarro's expeditions into South America. An archaeologist in the 1940s, I think this is 1947, named Thor Heyerdahl, he theorized that these river rafts were a lot more robust and well constructed than archaeologists had currently thought. And so he was so determined to prove that these rafts were not as primitive as previously thought. He thought that he may be able to prove that these indigenous rafts could potentially travel across the entire Pacific Ocean, that ancient people could navigate deep into the ocean, which, you know, we had thought that they were restricted to the coastlines and tributaries going inland. But in 1947, he launches an expedition to sail from Peru into French Polynesia, which is in the center of the Pacific Ocean, on a small raft that he named Kontiki. And it took him like 110 days or 111 days, and he finally made it to French Polynesia and proved that it was possible to sail across the entire Pacific Ocean on these ancient indigenous rafts. So if he was able to figure that out, there were certainly ancient Native Americans that probably did the same thing to some extent. And also, I should add vice versa, that people were coming from Polynesia, sailing across the Pacific Ocean, landing on Easter Island, and then sailing further into Peru, as well as all over the rest of the ancient world. So if that can be proven, it just opens up Pandora's box to the possibilities of well, now we know that people weren't just coming across the Bering Strait, that they may have been migrating from all over the world.
It's telling us that there was something really weird happened with settlement. You see, what happened with those African or Polynesian-looking skulls was that they were tested for DNA when DNA technology was not as advanced as it is today. And what that DNA showed was that they were more closely related to modern Native Americans than they are to any other people in the world. So the notion that there was some connection with Polynesia or Africa was dismissed. But now that we have very firm evidence of an Australasian genetic signal, Australian Aborigines, Papua New Guinea, Melanesians, with those kind of features. Now that we have the genetic evidence that is found in the Amazon, we have to go back to that old evidence and reconsider it.
Wow.
Yes. But I think that this is perhaps a slippery slope. Not that Graham is insinuating this. I'm just saying that running wild with these ideas that there is African DNA in the Amazon or DNA from dark-skinned people in Papua New Guinea, sure, that can be absolutely true. I don't think that we should then completely discredit ancient Americans for their feats, because I don't think that that is correct at all. I think there were probably navigators coming from other places in the world, let's say Papua New Guinea, Polynesia, Africa. Perhaps they were arriving in the Americas, let's say 1500 BC. Obviously, if they arrived, they must have been excellent oceanic navigators. That does not then mean that they were experts in large-scale agriculture and construction, architectural engineering. They could have just arrived and assimilated into a culture that was already doing that. And that's what I firmly believe was happening. I could always be wrong, but I think that the ancient Native Americans are responsible for the architecture that you see in the Americas.
Yeah, I would love to find out what that is. They've always fascinated me. The Olmecs, it's always been such a strange image, the large heads with the helmets on them, and how do they universally look like that? I mean, all of the features are very, very similar.
Wow. They're very, very, very similar.
And always with the helmets.
And almost always. I won't claim that every single Olmec head has a helmet of it, because I think I've seen one that didn't. It's quite a while ago since I...
Yeah, he would be correct about that. There's one, when you're looking at these helmets, they're 3,000, or when you're looking at these heads, they're 3,000 years old. It's not always easy to see the faded features that are on the heads, but there's one that looks like he has perhaps braided hair in the back, or it's some kind of dangling threads on the back of a helmet or some type of headdress. But yes, there may be one that doesn't have a helmet, but they all almost universally have helmets with all different designs on them. There's even one helmet that looks like it's completely made of cubes. I don't know how you explain that.
Since I explored the Olmec area. But what's fascinating about them is they are supposedly the first high civilization of Central America.
Not Central America, but Mexico. But that's not that big of a deal.
That you can see connections between them and the later Maya. That whole mystery of the Mayan calendar was clearly inherited from the Olmecs. It wasn't something the Maya made up. The Olmecs used that same symbolism. So
I could be wrong. I don't think they're using the same symbolism, but they're certainly keeping up with the same astronomical cycles, and they certainly are abiding, at least mentally, by the same calendar. And then the Maya sort of inherit that or grow up next to it.
The Olmecs may just be the latest, the earliest surviving manifestation of that calendar. It could go back much further than that.
Well, the idea that the Maya calendar goes back much further than the Olmecs is probably accurate if you're, again, just thinking about the fact that people are basing their entire lives on the cycle of the Maya calendar. Sure, I bet it goes back 10 to 20,000 years. It's not until the time of the Olmecs and definitely the Maya that this seems to be put on stone. Although that you see the Aztec solar disc a lot, and then you see the Maya calendar disc written in stone. That's actually not real. The Maya calendar stone does not actually exist. It's a fabrication that has become so popular that it's made its way to a point now where people think it actually exists, but it's just fake. It's just something that the Maya calendar is just something that the Maya people understood. It was like a part of speaking. It was their language. Certain aspects of it were written in stone, but the actual calendar was not carved out in stone like we imagine it to be. All in all, I don't think Graham Hancock said anything bad or egregious or anything that people could consider to be pseudoscientific or disparaging to ancient American civilizations. So yeah, did a good job in this clip. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you why I think that the current explanation for how the Olmecs moved these colossal 20 to 50 ton basalt heads across bodies of water must be wrong, and why we all need to rethink what ancient Americans were capable of. The Olmecs are perhaps ancient America's most inexplicable culture. They arrive on the archaeological record as a fully formed civilization with a complete artistic style and a hierarchical society with identifiably different figures such as shamans, kings, ball players, babies, and even the strange were-jaguar people who are depicted being carried as babies out of ancient caves or portals. And everything that I just listed warrants its own video. The shamans, the were-jaguar people, the strange ball players. I'll even have more videos about the colossal heads, as well as all of the strange Olmec megaliths that I guarantee most people have never seen before. All of these topics will be getting their own videos this year as I really focus in on the Olmecs. But today, though, I want to focus on one of the most glaring of the Olmec mysteries, why I believe that the currently held explanation for how the Olmecs moved these colossal basalt heads over 100 kilometers across vast bodies of water must be wrong. I will even try to provide some other evidence-based explanations. To begin, the first Olmec head was discovered by a Mexican man named Jose Maria in the late 1800s, but it wasn't until the early 1920s that archaeologists finally came around to giving this artifact a look. After explorer Franz Blom made the discovery of the Olmec twin statues in the Tuxtla Mountains of Veracruz. When he publicized these finds, archaeologists quickly noted that these statues didn't resemble anything else seen anywhere in the Mesoamerican world. They were of a much different style than the known Maya, Zapotec, Aztec, Teotihuacano cultures. I should also notice the similarity between these Olmec headdresses and the traditional pharaonic headdresses. I'm not implying a cultural connection here, but I do find it very interesting that we see similar mysteries across cultures, and the fact that no Egyptian or Olmec headdress or helmet has ever been found. In the 1930s, more Olmec heads would be discovered by Matthew Sterling and his wife Marion Sterling. She would be the one to decipher the epi-Olmec glyphs that prove the Olmecs actually predate the Maya. And honestly, an entire movie could be made over this woman who lived amongst the swamps of Veracruz, uncovering the secrets of the Olmecs while hunting crocodiles to make a crocodile skin purse. I have no idea why there aren't more movies based around archaeology. By the end of the 1940s, Sterling had discovered 7 Olmec heads ranging in size from 6 to over 40 tons. The heads seem to represent a ruling class, perhaps a king, but these kings are differentiated from the half-jaguar people and children depicted on the megalithic altars. The heads are also very likely portraits of different individuals, as each face has its own attributes and features that make them unique from each other. But with all of the secrets of the Olmec world that researchers are still trying to uncover, something that gets glossed over is that everyone, and I think archaeologists included, have quietly known for some time that the explanation for how these Olmec heads were moved across bodies of water is wrong. And I'm going to give an alternate explanation, something it's not based in science fiction, it's very evidence-based by looking at other cultures in the ancient Americas that could have lived contemporaneously with the Olmecs. So of the 17 known basalt Olmec heads, the smallest head, Monument 4, weighs an estimated 6 tons, while the most recent data for the largest head, La Cobada, weighs a staggering 50 tons. Now, in previous videos, I've stated that the La Cobada head seems to weigh somewhere between 40 and 42 tons, but it seems like recent data coming out is now putting that estimate at around 50 or just over 50 tons. Furthermore, we know that Olmec monuments were carved only after they'd been transported to the location they were intended to be placed. Out in the jungles of Veracruz, I have seen the unused remnants of these Olmec monuments scattered about the jungle floor. The archaeological literature supports this as well. What this means is the Olmecs were transporting unfinished stones for the heads that weighed potentially considerably more than they do today. So how exactly do archaeologists think that the Olmec heads were moved? Well, they suppose that the heads were moved using a combination of sledges, log rollers, and balsa river rafts. However, all of these assumptions are based on written chronicles of Spanish conquistadors in the Aztec heartland some 2,000 to 2,500 years later. In the early to mid 1500s, Spanish chroniclers did see Aztec people using wooden log rollers to transport extremely large stones. But can we really use a culture that lives in a similar geographical region to infer how a culture 2,000 years earlier might have behaved? Well, potentially, in some cases. For instance, the Olmec Monument 19, depicting what is almost certainly the Mesoamerican feathered serpent, is estimated to have been erected somewhere around 900 BC. Give or take some 500 years. This is long before we see the first traditional depiction of Quetzalcoatl on the temple facades at Teotihuacan around 150 AD. When we look at the later Guatemalan Papil Maya culture, we see them trying to recreate the Olmec heads in their own but slightly different style. We also see the Olmec iconography and style of dress being passed down to the Maya and then to the later Aztecs as well. So in some cases, we can observe that traditions and ideas of civilization are passed down over the course of 2,000 years or more. But what about the Olmecs just dragging the stones? Well, of course, if they were using ropes, those would have deteriorated thousands of years ago. But there may be evidence for it. 2 months ago, I was at the Museum of Mesoamerican History in Jalapa, Mexico. And while walking through the museum, I came across a monument depicting what appeared to be someone sitting on a carved block, wrapped with rope and possibly being pulled. Now, whether this is depicting some form of ancient palanquin, where an Olmec ruler sits on a solid block of basalt and is pulled from city to city by his subjects, nobody can really say for certain. But it is depicting ropes being tied around a large block, probably for pulling the block from one location to another, unless again there is a utility or purpose here that we can't comprehend, being 3,000 years disconnected from this culture. But I truly think that the most nebulous idea for how these Olmec heads were transported is by the traditional balsa river rafts. When you look at the study of the ancient Americas from a bird's eye view, it is believed that balsa river rafts that were built adequately enough to lift some of the smaller Olmec heads were actually first invented in the coastal cities of Ecuador and Colombia and weren't introduced into Mexico and Central America until sometime after 100 BC. That is according to the hard archaeological evidence. Thor Heyerdahl, one of the America's most legendary archaeologists and explorers, actually theorizes that these balsa rafts were of such a high quality construction that they could have been used to sail across the entire Pacific Ocean. And if that sounds crazy, he actually did it just to prove it was possible. In 1947, he led an expedition on a raft named Kon-Tiki to demonstrate ancient American ingenuity and how these people from both Polynesia and South America could have been ocean-faring civilizations using these vessels. Kon-Tiki was constructed based on the historical accounts and depictions of traditional balsa rafts that the Spanish witnessed the Inca and other South American tribes using. It was made from balsa logs tied tightly together with hemp ropes. It also featured a cabin on the deck of the ship which was made from bamboo. Lastly, the sails were woven together with locally available indigenous materials. And on April 18, 1947, after 101 days at sea, Thor Heyerdahl successfully sailed Kon-Tiki from Peru across the Pacific Ocean, landing in Raroia Atoll in the Tuamotu archipelago of French Polynesia. I probably butchered that horribly. And he proved that oceanic navigation on seemingly quote-unquote primitive but incredibly well-built balsa rafts was possible, which opens up Pandora's box to so many questions that are going to have to be addressed in later videos. Furthermore, according to the 1526 Spanish account of Bartolomé Ruiz, who was Pizarro's chief navigator, these boats had the capacity to support up to 10 to 30 tons of cargo. And contrary to what you might imagine, these quote-unquote rafts weren't a simple 10 by 10 foot construction. Literary sources tell us that these vessels could be up to 100 feet across and were built as robustly as many Spanish ships. So what's the problem here? Well, there are still two issues. First, the Olmecs are not thought to have had balsa river rafts that were nearly as sophisticated as what the Spanish encountered off the coast of South America. Furthermore, there isn't any archaeological evidence that the Olmecs ever actually had balsa river rafts. Archaeologists only come to this conclusion because looking at their vast trade networks, as they had an abundance of jade, which is typically found deep in Guatemala, far from the Olmec heartland, we can infer that vast amounts of materials were being transported across Mesoamerica deep in the remote past. But if we don't have a precedence for river rafts in the Olmec world, well, how are materials being transported? Due to the immense weight of moving valuable trade goods across these vast distances through jungles, swamps, deserts, and mountain ranges of Mesoamerica, it seems highly unlikely that these materials were being traded entirely on foot. Basically impossible. One thing we have to consider is, as far as we know, sock bays, meaning white road in Maya, weren't constructed until the pre-classic period around 300 BC, after the height of the Olmecs. And these sock bays were ancient highway systems laid with white limestone rock that covered the Maya world, spanning hundreds or perhaps thousands of miles. These roads were built in areas with limited river systems to act as a quicker way to deliver and trade goods. And why is this? It's because the river was the ancient world's highway, and the Olmec heartland is full of them. Like Egypt, the Olmec civilization sprouted because of its proximity to fresh water. Where Egypt's civilization was made great because of its ability to produce grain on the Nile, the Olmecs were able to mass produce corn on 4 different major river systems, and thus they became Mesoamerica's first wealthy civilization. So now that we understand why they were using river systems, we come to our last problem. Again, the means by which we are told the Olmecs transported these colossal heads must be wrong. But that's a big claim, and rather than explaining it myself, I'm going to let an archaeologist with more than 30 years experience in Mesoamerica explain it to you.
The way they hauled those basalt monuments to the site is perhaps the largest Olmec mystery that's still completely unsolved. Not all of the 100+ monuments at the site were huge, but the colossal heads and the altars sure were. Scholars still debate how they managed to move them 80 kilometers through swamps to the city's ridgetop. Most textbooks say that they floated them upriver on massive rafts, but we've all quietly known that that's wrong. They're just too heavy for that. A few years back, I had the good fortune of traveling with a nautical engineer named Michael. He was intrigued by this Olmec raft theory, but unlike my colleagues and I, he had the skills to actually evaluate it mathematically. A few weeks after our trip, he sent me this amazing Excel chart with embedded formulas. You could enter the weight of your Olmec head and the size of the balsa wood raft you were using to transport it. Even with a raft made of tree trunks 50 feet wide, anything over 5 tons would sink it. We've all kinda always known that the raft idea wouldn't work, but Michael's Excel chart calculator proved it to me. He actually went even further to theorize what might work. He suggested instead of a raft, lashing logs to the heads vertically. It's a lot harder to push a log into a body of water vertically. That's a basic principle of Archimedes' law of buoyancy. Anyhow, Michael's smart investigation only supported the mystery. How did they move them? Overland transport remains the only possibility, and even that seems impossible in swampy marshes.
Now, expanding on what Dr. Barnhart says here, if you were to build a primitive-style balsa raft that was 50 feet long, an Olmec head weighing more than 5 tons would sink the raft. Well, there's 2 more problems here. Problem A, the smallest Olmec head is 6 tons, with the largest head now being estimated over 50 tons. Problem B, if you constructed a balsa raft 50 feet long, it would be too large to travel down certain areas of the Olmec rivers and tributaries. And when we reach this point, it seems like there's absolutely no way that the colossal Olmec heads could have ever been transported by boat. They're too large, they're too heavy, and even the smallest head would sink a raft that's too long to sail down the river. And you could say that perhaps they weren't transported down rivers at all, but when you look at the Olmec heartland, it is littered with rivers, and avoiding them becomes impossible. But when I was reading through a research paper detailing the finds at a small Olmec site called El Remolino, I found something very interesting that may explain this mystery. Not much is known about this site other than radiocarbon dates that seem to place it at the beginning of Olmec civilization during the San Lorenzo phase around 1200 BC, where in 2008 an archaeological expedition led by Alfredo Calderon discovered the remnants of an ancient, highly flexible and durable asphalt that was still intact, lining the remnants of an Olmec canoe. Well, a canoe is a brand brand new discovery. Up to this point, the Olmecs have been thought to only have had balsa river rafts. But now we have canoes, a much more sophisticated vessel, as well as a sophisticated form of asphalt used to seal the boat's boards together. The discovery of this Olmec asphalt is not something I have ever seen spoken about before finding this short article online. Furthermore, it just shows how much of a delay there is between an archaeological discovery and when that discovery reaches the popular consensus or a popular audience. It also reminds me of the discovery of Roman concrete and Amazonian terra preta. Both are ingenious inventions that still puzzle archaeologists who are trying to recreate these ancient compounds even today. So what is the answer as to how the Olmecs transported these colossal megalithic monuments across their rivers and tributaries? I would fair to say that it's very likely that the Olmecs were much farther along in their trade networks and boat building than they've currently been given credit for. We see this similar were-jaguar, half-human, half-jaguar iconography appearing in the Olmec regions of Mesoamerica and in South America right around the same time, which I think indicates a much larger and more interconnected trade network and a vast exchange of ideas across the Americas going much farther back in time than is currently accepted. And I also think that there are very likely much more sophisticated Olmec boats that haven't been discovered yet, possibly buried deep within the banks along the rivers and tributaries of the Olmec heartland. But unfortunately, INA, Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, has a lot of ground to cover, from archaeology in North Mexico to Mexico City at Teotihuacan and Templo Mayor, not to mention the shaft tombs in western Mexico, and then the Zapotecs Monte Alban, Mitla, Cholula, and even the hundreds of Maya cities scattered across Mexico. With almost all of these sites gaining more notoriety than anything in the Olmec world, Olmec research in the low swamps of Veracruz and Tabasco gets literally flown over and doesn't receive the kind of funding that other more famous cultures and sites do. It's my opinion that the Olmecs were much more advanced, much further along, and much more sophisticated than they're currently given credit for. And that's not to say that archaeologists think that they were overly primitive or not sophisticated. I just think that there is much more to discover in the Olmec world, and as discoveries and archaeological excavations continue very slowly, I think that we're going to begin to realize just how sophisticated the Olmecs were.
How's it going, everybody? It's I can't believe, I feel like we stepped in a wormhole since last year. The last year's gone by so fast, but it's great to see you all again, and thank you all for coming. Let me see. So I want to, I'll just introduce myself first off for anybody new that's filtering in. So my name is Luke Caverns. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I study and investigate the interaction of ancient cultures. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today because we know so little about the Olmecs that we have to infer so much about them by the cultures that they interacted with and the cultures that they inspired later on. So at the very beginning, I want to read an excerpt. I was reading through, has anybody ever heard of the ancient author Plutarch before? So Plutarch was an late first century, early second century author out of Greece. And his writings are preserved because they weren't kept in the Library of Alexandria or the Library of Ephesus, which were attacked and burned by the Romans. And he has a really cool quote that I wanted to read here. And he's writing to one of his friends, and he says, "You know, Seneca, how geographers, when they come to deal with these parts of the world where they know nothing about, and they crowd them into margins on their little maps with the explanations like, beyond this lie sandy, waterless deserts full of wild beasts and feral people, or trackless swamps and Scythian snows, or ice-locked seas. Now that in my writing of the parallel lives, I've reached the end of those periods, which can be tested by argument, or history can be found, or a solid foundation, in fact. He said, all that lies at this point are the prodigies and fables of the province and poets and romancers where nothing is certain. And that's him talking about the very, very earliest people in ancient Greece. And I feel like that kind of sets us up for the Cosmic Summit, where a lot of us are exploring things that are so far in the remote past that it's this kind of hazy primordial sea that we're trying to sift through very scant evidence to figure out. And so that takes us to 20,000 years ago in Mesoamerica. So Mesoamerica 20,000 years ago, people are just farming haze. They have they're raising maize. And so they have these long, gigantic farms extending all the way from northern Mesoamerica all the way down to where Mesoamerica connects with South America. It even continues into South America. But of all of the cultures that are raising maize, there's one that stands out among all the rest, and they were along the Coetzalcoatl River. So the Coetzalcoatl River has the richest soil in all of Mesoamerica, able to produce the finest maize and the most abundance of maize. And then what comes from them is the Olmecs, which is very, very similar to the Egyptians. What made the Egyptians powerful was the Nile River, their ability to be able to produce grain. It exploded their economy long before anybody else. So we see the same thing in San Lorenzo, Mexico, among the Olmecs. And this is one of the 7 fertile crescents of the ancient world. And so this is a photo that I got with my drone shot early in the morning a couple months ago. And that is the iconic head of San Lorenzo. So what has been found in the Olmec world? So we have the colossal basalt heads. Now, these basalt heads are found at various depths under the soil. Originally, when you go on Wikipedia and you look, it says about 6 feet. But the problem with studying Mesoamerica is that it's not until you actually get down in the jungles and the sticks out there and you speak to people who have been living there for decades that you begin to hear things that you don't hear online. And so there was an archaeologist there who was in his 80s, still walking around the archaeological site with us. And my mentor, Dr. Barnhart, and I are talking to him. And of course, he can only speak Spanish, so Dr. Barnhart's having to translate for us. And he's talking to him about the iconic San Lorenzo head here on the right. And he's saying, so how far down was the San Lorenzo head found? About 6 feet? And the guy's like, no, 60 feet. And Dr. Barnhart goes, 60 feet? And he's like 16 feet, and the Mexican guy is like, no, 60 feet, which blew everybody's mind. And all the other archaeologists that were there were like, they corroborated this as well. So they find 17 known Olmec heads throughout the Olmec world, all ranging between 6 tons and 42 tons. But that 42-ton number, just within the last month, got pushed back up to 52. So we'll get to that. That is the La Cobada head. So this is 52 tons, and it's displayed in the city of Jalapa. The next thing that we find are these megalithic altars. So usually almost all of the altars, and we'll see a couple more of these, depict we don't really know what the role of this person was, but it's somebody coming out of a portal or a cave, which we think harkens back to the very origins of Olmec society. And above that, on the facade of the altars, you see this jaguar feline being. And another thing about these altars is that everybody can see the lip that's up at the top. That lip in depth, where it connects to the rest of the stone, is the same depth as the lip on the right, and the lip on the left has either been cut or filed or fallen off. I doubt it's been fallen off. But these altars weighed anywhere from about 40 to 50 tons, and they were carved on the site that they were transported to. And we're going to get more into this. But these were solid blocks, and when they finally reached their final destination, they were then chipped off. So you can imagine how much more heavy this would be with all of the extra block on there. And we know that for certain because the remnants of what was left on these megaliths is just buried right next to it that they've excavated. So the next thing that has been discovered, which very, very few people have seen, are these megalithic column tombs. Now, each of these columns are well over my head, probably 7 to 8 feet tall, and they all weigh between 2 to 7 tons apiece. And a tomb like this weighs in total, we calculated it a couple months ago when we were at La Venta, we calculated it to be around 250 tons. And, of course, they're not all interconnected. They're connected like Lincoln logs, but they were all probably transported at the same time. This is also the longest basalt column that we found, and the estimates for this column are about 20 tons. We also find these very, very strange mosaics. So we found 5 of these mosaics all throughout the Olmec area. And what's so strange about them is this top layer that you see is just one layer of 28 other layers full of about 480 serpentine blocks on each layer, and they're all buried at exactly the same time. When geologists come and look at these caches, they're able to look at the soil and determine, okay, all of this was buried at the same time. It wasn't one layer, and then it was covered up over time. They had 28 layers of serpentine blocks stacked up on top of each other, all with different patterns. This pattern right here is supposed to represent, and you can kind of only see it if you're very familiar with Mesoamerican iconography, but it's supposed to represent a jaguar's face. But each different mosaic, all 28 layers, have a different pattern, all buried at the same time and completely covered up. Complete mystery. And one of the estimates for the serpentine blocks stacked together puts all of that at around 1,200 tons of serpentine blocks. There is also the oldest Mesoamerican pyramid. This is the Pyramid of Levanta. As we're going to see throughout this presentation, we don't really know exactly how old the Olmec world is, but estimates put this somewhere around 1000 BC. But if you were to look it up on Wikipedia, they go, well, it was made somewhere between 1400 BC and 400 BC. So the estimates are very, very uncertain. But this is about 150 feet tall, and it contains about 200,000 tons of earth and fill. So we also have monolithic monuments. Now this one, I just call it the Sphinx. It doesn't really have a name. We obviously don't know what the Olmecs called it. We don't even know what the Olmecs called themselves. Their culture is completely gone. The only reason that we call the Olmecs is because when conquistadors were interacting with the Aztecs at around 1519 to 1521, they referred to the people in the rubber region as the Olmecs or the Olmecas, people from the land of rubber, or the rubber people. So anyways, these are, what I'm going to show in the next couple slides are monolithic monuments that are found. Now, these, it's kind of like an illusion. They may look like they're small. The head that you're looking at is about this big, and it's carved out of solid basalt. And basalt is like a 6 or a 7 on the Mohs scale, very, very similar hardness to granite. And on the right side of that head, well, I guess it's the left side on here, but on the left side of that head, where it looks like, when I first saw it, I thought, okay, well, maybe the underside of the head has been buried underground, and this right side or this left side looks like it's been eroded over time. But I was completely wrong. That erosion wouldn't even look like that on basalt, and basalt wouldn't erode that much. All of that was carved to look like that. This is a piece of artwork. And so I looked at this, and I spoke with one of the archaeologists there, and he's like, well, maybe it's indicating that somehow half of the head is turning into smoke, so they carved into the head to make it look like the head is pluming away. And what's really interesting is it was hard to get great photos of this. On the back side of that head, you can see two humanoid but jaguar paws gripping onto the side of the head and pulling the head apart. And you can see the wrists on the bottom of these hands. And I thought that was very strange, and I thought, well, I wonder where the rest of this monument is. And I walk around the side of this little museum, and which I should say, these museums, by the way, these are so far out into the sticks and the jungles in Veracruz and Tabasco, that when you get there, the indigenous, Maya people that are there, when they see a bunch of gringos get off of the van, everybody in town comes with little popsicles and trinkets and things they're going to sell you, because they haven't seen people come from out of town in weeks. And when we show up to these museums, it's not a museum. It's a room about maybe half the size of this area, with some wooden walls and a metal ceiling over the top. And it's just to preserve these monuments. Just put them in there so that the rain doesn't erode them anymore. And they might have a little log where it notes, the last time people have been there, and the last time somebody had been here was December, and this was March. So it had been months and months and months before anybody had looked at this. And you're not going to find these on the internet. So much of what I'm about to show you, you're just not going to see it on the internet. I didn't even know that it existed before I saw it. So I saw this little sphinx-looking body sitting on the outside of it, and this sphinx body is about this big. Some of the pictures make it look like it's small, but it's about this big. Again, carved out of solid basalt. And so we scanned it, and if you take 3D models of it, you're able to place these two items together. So This is just one of the monuments. This is just one of the monuments that we found, and really closely. I'm not sure if it's how high definition it is, but the carving on it and the detail work on it is just amazing. I have all these videos posted on my website, and you can click links to see this stuff in high definition. Now, here are some other very obscure monuments. So at the top left, we see what is called a tenon head. Does anybody here know what a tenon head is? It's essentially a statue with a tenon on the back of it, and it sits up and slides into place inside of a temple. Now, the thing about that tenon head is it's probably from here all the way to here. It's about this big. And we don't even know what temple this tenon head would have slid into. Whatever temple it was in is gone. We know that ancient Mesoamerican cultures were taking Olmec monuments and trying their best to move them. And so smaller monuments like this can be found completely out of place, scattered across Mesoamerica, or found at archaeological sites where Olmec monuments obviously weren't created. Then in the center at the top, we see these spheres. Has anybody ever seen this anomaly of these megalithic spheres being found all throughout Mesoamerica and Central America? Well, they had thought that these mostly originated out of Costa Rica, and that they may be natural, but it's very strange that we find it in the Olmec world as well. At the top right, we also see probably a later depiction. It's not the very first depiction of Quetzalcoatl, which is the feathered serpent. I'm sure people here know that. Now, these two guys here at the bottom middle and the bottom left, especially the bottom left, how strangely Egyptian does that basalt, the coloring of it makes it look like it's limestone. But so many of the monuments, when I was walking around, I was like, man, this looks like an obscure Egyptian monument that would be, when you're walking up to an Egyptian temple off to the left, some other smaller statue, they look so Egyptian. And the detail work behind them is just absolutely incredible. Again, this bird is probably about this tall, about this big. There's also the basalt bird in the center, and look at the detail work on each one of the feathers all around the bird. And then on the right, you have like a megalithic facade of a face, and this face is probably this tall, about this wide. And so you've got your iconic sort of Olmec were-jaguar crying face. So these are just some of the few monoliths found all throughout the Olmec world with absolutely no explanation. If you guys thought that you were going to come here and I was going to answer questions, you're completely wrong. But I'm going to show you guys things that can't really be explained. So next we have this. This is actually really impressive. We have a white andesite seashell. So it's actually how it looks like it's very rough. It was made. Archaeologists who look at it, they think that it was polished and then the surface of it was made to look porous and rough like a seashell. Now this seashell carved out of white andesite, about a 7 on the Mohs scale, right up there with granite, and this seashell is probably about this big. And it was found at Tres Zapotes, which is one of the three. You have your 3 major Olmec sites. You have San Lorenzo, Tres Zapotes, and La Venta. This was found at Tres Zapotes. And again, the meaning of it, we don't really know. Obviously just a piece of art, but how they did these things and the tools by which all of these monuments are made, we have no idea how the Olmecs did this. Hardly anything is left in the archaeological record of their stonework. And the thing about the Olmecs is, how many times have we heard it sounds like the Egyptians just begin out of nowhere. From the very beginning, they're building pyramids. It is exactly the same thing in the Olmec world. Actually, even more so. In the Egyptian world, we have something that's called the Narmer palette, which is from about 3100 BC, and it's a slate palette about this big, and it depicts the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And so, according to the traditional Egyptological timeline, of course, they say that there's about maybe 500 years of history leading into the pyramids, but with very, very minimal massive architecture, and then boom, we start with the pyramids. In the Olmec world, there is actually nothing before this. There's nothing before it at all. All we know of is when they excavate down in sites, they find these ancient farms. They find absolutely nothing like this. No stone artwork, no architecture at all. It just all begins just like that around 1600 BC. There's nothing gradually leading into this. So as we continue, this is probably one of my favorites, Monument 19. Has anybody else seen this before? So Monument 19 is commonly cited to be the very first depiction of the feathered serpent. Now, this comes from Levinta. I put it around 900 BC because if you go on Wikipedia, they say it was made between 1400 BC and 400 BC, and the estimates are just so wrong. Can anybody else tell me what else is important about this monument? Handbags. Yep, it looks like a helmet. We are going to cover all of that. Now we get into the enigmas. We'll begin with moving the heads. So the unknown means of transportation. So like I was saying earlier, these mosaics are over 1,000 tons of serpentine stone for just one cache. And in that middle representation, you can see that's an artwork of them. Say that's a bottom layer, and they're going to have 28 more layers on top of that, and then they're going to cover it all up. Absolutely no explanation as to how or why they would do that. And then we also find they also have altars that they moved, and I covered altar 4 earlier, which weighed 50 tons before it was carved. And then we have heads that weigh between 6 and 50 tons, and then we have the basalt columns weighing between about 2 to 7 tons, and column tombs as a whole weigh much more than 200 tons. And the only known form of transportation that archaeologists suppose are these balsa wood river rafts. Now, the problem with that is that my professor and I worked on a little project together, and we're working on it again right now. We travel with a nautical engineer into the Olmec heartland, and he was really, really obsessed with, I don't really know if these basalt or these balsa wood river rafts are capable of moving these megaliths. And so he developed a program where you could enter in your hypothetical balsa river raft, the size of your hypothetical river raft, along with the size of your hypothetical head. And what he found is that if you made a raft that was too wide and too long to actually sail down the Coetzcalcos River, which is where they assumed that they would have brought the heads from the Sierra de la Tuxtla Mountains that I'll show here in a second. If you built a raft that was too wide and too long to go down the river, and then you placed a 5-ton Olmec head on the raft, it would sink the raft. But the smallest head is 6 tons, and the biggest head is 50 tons. So it's impossible that they could have moved them in simple balsa river rafts. And this is just a representation that I drew of how they think that the route of transportation would have come from the basalt quarries in the Sierra de la Tuxtla Mountains all the way down to the farthest city, which is La Venta. This is about 89 kilometers. So this is over extremely steep mountains, through the jungles, through the swamps, and across rivers. And we really just have absolutely no evidence at all as to how these monuments were moved. One of the other ideas that is currently being worked on, there's being a paper written about it right now, is this idea if they were moved by magnets, possibly. And so this comes from these magnetite cubes that were found at San Lorenzo, and they're also now being found at La Venta, as well as Tres Zapotes. And the original idea for these cubes was that maybe that they were used as weights in fishing nets, and so they're casting them into the river and they're being used in weights that way. But the problem is that all of the magnetic cubes in the Olmec world were found in one single cache of 7 tons right next to the Red Palace at San Lorenzo. So they were all buried in one cache. We don't find them scattered about by the rivers. It looks like the royal people in the Olmec world had these cache of magnetic cubes, and then they buried them right next to their main temple. And then here's just another photo showing, and you can see on one of the Olmec heads, you can see those cubes that are on there. That's very, very similar. And so this is an idea that's currently being worked on, currently being tested, and obviously absolutely no academics would subscribe to this idea having any legitimacy. So next we get to the elongated skulls, the were-jaguars, and ancient kings. So who is the were-jaguar child? Was it a king, or was it a shaman, or was it both? So on the left, we see another one of these altars where it's a shaman emerging with a child out of a portal or a cave, and we think that this may harken back to a proto-Olmec society that lived in the Guerrero Mountains of Mexico. And the only thing is, outside of those, or inside those caves, we find paintings, but archaeological research has sort of been halted there because it's an extremely dangerous place to do research in. There were some scientists there that were working. They were entomologists working at a local lake, and they were killed by a cartel in Mexico recently out there. So we can't really, some of these things we can't go back and study safely, at least right now. But he's emerging out of this portal or cave, and you can see that he has this tall hat on, which very likely he has an elongated skull underneath that. And then he's also holding a child, and when you look at this child's face, it has these feline downturned lips and these fangs coming out, as well as these feline eyes and an elongated skull. And you could think like, well, maybe that's just the art style, but it's certainly not, because all of the Olmec rulers are depicted with having normal-shaped heads. So we see a difference here. We have the heads, which we think are rulers. We have elongated skulls and were-jaguar people, which we think could be shamans or people, who have this voice from the outer world. And then here's another depiction. This is actually the same altar that's shown here on the left. So we see on the left side, you see these elongated, all four of these figures are elongated skulls. You have two adults, both holding babies, and they're kind of clutching their babies back as if they're scared of what is perhaps coming out of this portal. But they all have these downturned lips. One even has the iconic Olmec cleft head, that baby that's in the center. And so they're all obviously present at whatever this procession or ceremony is of carrying this baby out of this cave, of whatever this means. Also, look at the headdresses and the hats that they're wearing. On the left, how similar does that look to the Egyptian crown that you see, the one piece of the back crown? And you also see the serpent heads coming off of the top of the hats as well. Very, very similar to Egyptian headdress iconography. And we're going to see something even more similar here in a minute. And then also just remember to look on the right. You can see that definitely there's probably an elongated skull beneath that head. So there is an idea that comes from about 1520 when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the city of Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital of Mesoamerica, or of their Triple Alliance. And they said that the city was so absolutely incredible that when they left, they were asking each other, is what we saw, did we just dream the city that we saw? In Tenochtitlan, this isn't talked about a lot because it's a fairly recent city. It fell in 1521. They had zoos and aquariums and astronomical observatories with pools on the ground and mathematical formulas calculating the stars. They were standing on giants of the rest of the Mesoamerican world. And when Cortez went to Moctezuma's palace, sitting around his palace were people with deformities, people who had mental deficiencies, deformities, anything that we would consider abnormal. All of these people were being cared for and taken care of in the palace next to Moctezuma, which is completely foreign to our Western thought, where you look at Greek, iconography, and they essentially Photoshop people in Greek iconography, make them look a little bit more proportional, make them look a little bit better. But in the Mesoamerican world, they held people with any kind of deficiency up on a pedestal, and they thought that they were touched by the gods, that there was something special and unique about them. And so we see this in the Maya world as well, which predates the Aztecs. There's a temple at the top of this mountain at Yaxchilan that I saw last year, and at the bottom of the temple we see Bird Jaguar IV, who was he was a king of Yaxchilan. He's being followed in a procession by dwarfs, and the Maya people really venerated dwarfs and people with deformities as well. And so I think that there may be an explanation in the Olmec world for ectodermal dysplasia. And I think that they could have been selectively breeding people who, this is followed up by some science as well. We see a common reoccurrence of ectodermal dysplasia in Veracruz today. Ectodermal dysplasia does not come with any learning disabilities at all. There isn't a prevalence of them. What happens is they're just born with a deformity where they have these two front teeth that are fangs. And I think that they were selectively breeding these people because we see two completely different classes of people throughout the Olmec world. Now, to be able to study this and find concrete evidence of this is almost impossible unless we find more skulls or more bodies that actually have proof of this deficiency. However, the problem with that is we know nothing about the Olmec culture. We have no idea what happens to these were-jaguar people when they die because we've hardly found any Olmec bodies to begin with, but it's the same thing with all of the Roman emperors. I mean, I don't know if anybody here realized that there is no body of a Roman emperor that survives because their bodies were sacred and they were cremated when they died. Something very similar could have been happening in the Olmec world, and there's not going to be evidence of these people with ectodermal dysplasia in the Olmec world. But I think it's a likelihood because we see a disproportionate amount of children in Veracruz today being born with this deficiency. So who had elongated skulls? Now, these are two elongated skulls that I photographed when I was in Veracruz just a couple of months ago, and it's pretty significant. When I say we don't have a lot of Olmec bodies to begin with, we have maybe like a handful, probably just less than 10, but there are a lot of Veracruz culture people, like the city of El Tajín. We have lots of bodies from there. And these cultures in some ways continued the culture of the Olmecs well into the height of the Mesoamerican world. So again, we see a differentiation between this Olmec ruler looks like he may have an elongated head, but it's just hard to say. It could just be the size of the stone. But here on the left, we see a group of jadeite figures that are gathered around. This is taking place at La Venta. They're gathered in front of 16 giant stelae. And six giant stelae. This is in front of the pyramid of La Venta that I showed you guys earlier. And those stelae are still there today. I saw them earlier this year. So what's really interesting is this is like a screenshot. We have no context of what it is, but it's a screenshot of the Olmec world. We see these various jadeite people standing in front of these columns, and they're all made out of jadeite, but there's one made out of redstone, and he's in the center, in the middle, looking at everybody, and he has 4 or 5 people walking in front of him. Again, we don't know what the purpose of this is, but it's a screenshot into something that was happening in the Olmec world, but we have no context for it. Another really strange thing about this is that this cache was buried 6 feet under the ground at La Venta. And when they studied the geological layers when this was discovered, what they found was that this was buried around maybe 400 BC-ish. At the very latest, it was buried at 400 BC at La Venta. And 1,000 years later, somebody came along. So that would be what, 600 AD? 1,000 years later, somebody came along, dug down, uncovered just the heads of this procession, and then buried it again. And we have absolutely no idea what was going on here. Another thing I want to emphasize is when we study the Mesoamerican world, and I'm going to tell you why here in a minute, anything that you think makes sense or anything that you think makes common sense, just grab it and throw it away. Because we're studying people who may as well have lived on Mars. This culture is not anything like ours. They didn't think about things the same way that we do. It is a completely lost civilization. Really, just not even the Olmec world, but half of the entire planet of the ancient Americas are people that were completely different than us. So continuing, we also see the depiction again on that altar of these elongated heads underneath these large headdresses. Now, this statue on the right is really heavily eroded. This is made out of sandstone. But what it depicts when you get a 3D view of it is on the front side of the head, there is a normal Olmec-looking face. On each of the 2 sides is a face that's being kind of gnarled and twisted, and on the back side you have a feline face. And so what this is showing is somebody's head spinning around and becoming one of these were-jaguar people. And so, in ancient Egypt you see very stoic statues of people standing eternally still, but in the Olmec world, these statues are supposed to represent movement. And this one here on the right is like the most unambiguous example of that. So continuing, kind of what I was talking about before, you have these unique headdresses that are adorned with snakes on the front. Now look at that one on the front where you see, or that one on the right where you see the snake coming out of the front. Just so similar to Egyptian iconography. And I know I'm kind of teasing that, but I'm going to touch on that later on. Another thing is where are the headdresses and the helmets? Look at the bottom center. How much does that look like the traditional iconic pharaoh's headdress? Now, I should say again, None of those headdresses in Egypt, none of the headdresses in the Olmec world, none of these have ever been found. We have no idea what they were made of. There's no actual archaeological evidence of them, hard evidence of them, but we see it in iconography. And then here on the left is just kind of a drawing of what, I guess this kind of a standard compilation of Mesoamerican people would have looked like with Olmec heads as well. Now we have the unknown Olmec heads. These 3 heads are not anything you're going to find on the internet. Maybe they're down some very dark hole. I have no idea, but I have never seen anything like this before. Now this is, you can see it's in one of these. It's a fairly nice little museum at the archaeological site of La Venta, but nobody had been here in months before we walked in. And Dr. Barnhart and I, he's been an archaeologist. He's a world-class Mesoamerican archaeologist for the last 3 decades. And we walk into this little museum with just a little metal roof, and we walk in, and there's these 3 gigantic limestone, sandstone Olmec heads standing in front of us. And typically, we only know of the 17 basalt heads. And he and I look at each other, and we go, what the hell is that? You're not going to find these anywhere. But it's sandstone, unfortunately, so the faces are so eroded. But it's alluding to the fact that there are probably, there's obviously definitely many more basalt heads, but there's probably so many more sandstone and limestone heads that over the last at least 3,000, 3,500 years of sitting in the jungle and being rained on and then being covered up by the soil, that even if they were uncovered, they would look like this massive blob of sandstone and limestone. So, civilization in isolation. Did the Olmecs really just arrive out of nowhere without any outside influence at all? One thing that's commonly talked about is, do the Olmecs have some kind of African origin? People look at the Olmec heads, and it's very popular to say, oh, well, they look like they have the big noses and the big lips, and they look like they're African. And I'm going to address that in a second. But one of the actual pieces of evidence that I see for Africans in the Mesoamerican and Caribbean world is something that's really, really strange in linguistics. So when Columbus showed up in the Bahamas and then later moved into the Caribbean, he met Carib people who had metal alloy tipped bows, arrows, and spears. And what they called that alloy, and Columbus is obviously looking for riches now. He's looking for things to send back to Spain to make money to keep funding further expeditions, and he wants to, set up colonies and really, exploit the New World, extract it for everything it's worth. He's asking them, where are these metal alloys from? And they say, it's guanine, it's guanine. It comes from these dark-skinned sailors that came up from the Southeast Seas. And again, what the Caribs had very dark skin. So if they're calling other tribes dark-skinned people, that means that the other people had very, very dark skin, which would be unlike what we see in the ancient Americas. Now, in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, metal alloy is called guanin. So in the Caribbean, when Columbus arrives, it's called guanine. In the ancient sub-Saharan African cultures, they call their metal alloys guanin. So you see just this little tiny nugget of evidence for African presence in the Mesoamerican world. With that, I want to say that Olmec heads actually do look like Veracruz people. We were at this little museum, and I knock on the door, and it takes 5 minutes for somebody to answer. And when this guy does answer, he's this big, tall, 6'5", heavy-set guy, and I look up at him, and I immediately go, oh, that's an Olmec head on this guy's body. He had the big lips, he had the big nose, the big eyes, the big chubby cheeks, and I was like, I'm definitely in the right place. And so they absolutely do look like people in the Olmec world. However, I cannot explain this monument. This is another tenon head in the Olmec world. This is the largest tenon head. Just the head itself is about this big, and the tenon on the back of it is about as long as I am tall. So I cannot explain this. There is no explanation for it. You ask the archaeologists there, and they say, oh, it's Olmec. I'm like, that's not Olmec. It's something different. Again, though, there's absolutely no context for these artifacts, and all we can do is look at it and find these little tiny kernels of evidence that may allude to the idea that possibly seafaring sub-Saharan Africans were visiting these areas, and possibly they're depicted on iconography, but I definitely don't think that the traditional Olmec heads depict Africans. However, this guy, just not sure. However, we get to something that's one of my favorites is this is Monument 13 here on the left. And in Monument 13, I'm going to have to use my pointer finally. In Monument 13, we see a couple of interesting things that aren't really depicted elsewhere in the Olmec world. So we see this guy wearing this long draping headdress. Does this look like any of the other Olmec headdresses I've been showing you guys, where it's like kind of a long turban hanging off his head? No. This right here, you can see he's got boots on with pointed shoes. We have no prevalence for boots. Later on in Mesoamerica, they start inventing sandals and wearing sandals, but for the vast majority of the time, these guys had monkey feet. They had really, really strong feet, and they're walking everywhere barefooted. We also see that he has a belt kind of hanging off with like a little draping cloth on the end, and he's also holding a flag. He also has a thick mustache and a thick beard coming down. And that's all great, except none of these have a prevalence in the Mesoamerican world. In fact, flags, In fact, flags are actually one of the places that they're invented is the Naqada cultures, which is pre-dynastic Egypt. So they have these little reed boats going up and down the Nile, and they plant these little flags on it to show the tribe and village that they're from. And this is very, very early prehistoric Egypt. So flags come from the Mediterranean world. Flags were not used in Mesoamerica. Furthermore, these big, thick, dense beards that's depicted here, these are not Mesoamerican either. Mesoamericans were they're even known today. If you look at photos of Native Americans during the 1800s, they have completely clean faces, and if they do have a beard, it's very, very, it's not a thick beard like you see in the Mediterranean world. So this monument right here, and then let alone, I should say, turbans. I mean, that is a Mediterranean headdress. Nobody in the Native Americas were wearing turbans. Now, this monument here is dated to be around 900 BC because it was found sitting just above a tomb with a body that when it was carbon dated, they think that the body was about 900 BC. Now, how concrete that is, you've got to answer that for yourself. But right here, we also see a man depicted from San Lorenzo. Now, this is kind of like a terracotta head. Now, this terracotta head with these high cheekbones and this pointed chin with this little beard and the mustache and the turban as well, not Mesoamerican whatsoever. Now, at 900 BC, a civilization called the Phoenicians, which were kind of in some ways, they were like a roaming tribe around the Mediterranean. They were fantastic sailors. They were sending out expeditions through the gates of Hercules around Africa and then back. And so they were going to be one of the first cultures to sail all the way around Africa and map that sea. Now, what's interesting is these Phoenician records show that some of these expeditions went off and never came back. Or one that did come back said that they found this giant island landmass with absolutely nobody living on it. And that's kind of the end. Some of these records are found on these clay tablets, and there's just almost no evidence of this anymore. Now, what researchers have been finding is that if you send a boat out of the gates of Hercules, which is, the exit of the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic Ocean, if you send it just a little bit too far out and you send it a little bit too far west, the current of the Atlantic Ocean will actually carry it all the way across the Atlantic, down into the Bahamas, through the Caribbean, and into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's possible that it's possible that a lost Phoenician vessel could have found its way by following a current down into the Bahamas, the Caribbean, and then they interacted with what was the most developed culture at the time and made their way into a cameo on Olmec iconography. That's my theory, at least, and very few other people's theories. Now, as we continue, I wonder if there's also some kind of Amazonian origin as well. This is a whole rabbit hole that I could go down. But this fanged deity, this were-jaguar person, is not exclusive to the Olmec world. We also see it in South American cultures. And originally, it's depicted at a culture called Chavin de Hontar. Has anybody here ever heard of that? It's very not a very well-known place. But these tenon heads, it's also the only other place that we see a tenon head. Can you see at the bottom right that head that is sitting within those bricks? There's a tenon on the back of it, and that head is slid in. We also see that same iconography at Tiwanaku, which I'm sure everybody here knows of that. So I wonder if there's some kind of connections between these cultures, because they're both certainly around at about the 900 BC area. And I've drawn a map here. This would have been how far the contact would have to be if they weren't just sailing, which I feel like sailing, even though we don't have evidence of it, I feel like sailing is more reasonable, because these jungles are extremely hard to get through, especially in Panama. That's one of the most dangerous jungles in the entire world. So the next thing I want to get into is, I've kind of been alluding this connection across the Atlantic Ocean between Olmec iconography, Mesoamerican iconography, and things that we see in the Old World. And this is something that I have caught on to in just the last couple of years that I have not seen anybody ever talk about. Has anyone ever seen this before? This is the most common ancient symbol in the world. It is found all over the ancient world, and I have dug and dug and dug and dug and dug for a concrete explanation as to what the meander is, and you cannot find anything. The only I guess hard answer that I ever get is that it represents river systems. Maybe that would make sense in the Amazon, but the problem is, one of the earliest places that we see this is in ancient Greece, and they have their own rivers, but they certainly don't have many rivers that look like this, and I think that that's kind of a cheap explanation. So these are found in the Dipylon vases from ancient Greece they appear during the geometric age between 750 to 900 BC. This is just after the dark ages of ancient Greece, when ancient Greece is beginning to bloom again after the collapse of the Bronze Age. We see this meander appear. We also see it on Philip II's shield. He was king of Macedon in 350 BC. He's the father of Alexander the Great. Philip is assassinated at a wedding in front of Alexander. Alexander then goes on to conquer all of Persia, and before he expires at the age of 32, he establishes the city of Alexandria. Alexandria, when they begin excavating the murals at Alexandria, the very lowest levels underneath the modern-day city, they end up finding Greco-Egyptian mosaics. And these next two I'm about to show are the two oldest mosaics that have ever been discovered. And you can very clearly see different variations of these meandering patterns along the mosaics. And mosaics, I should say, that's their floor. It's made out of little bits of stone that are either painted, or they choose the right color of stone, and they make these mosaics. And we see this iconography continuing. Here's another example of this. This is also in Alexandria. I'm sure everybody recognizes this as the flower of life. So ancient Alexandrians, this is where all of the knowledge of the ancient old world all came together. Alexandria was known as the light of the world. They essentially had a gravitational pull for all of the world's knowledge, and they kept it in the library and in the museum. Now, unfortunately, in 48 BC, during the Roman Civil War, Julius Caesar lights the docks of Alexandria on fire to prevent Pompey's legions from fleeing, and the fire spreads up the docks and burns down the library. Now, how many academics have you heard say, well, it wasn't that significant anyways. It was already in decay, and really the burning wasn't that big of a deal. Have you guys ever heard academics say that before? Well, we know that that's not true, because after Julius Caesar's assassination, and one of the guys that was close to Julius Caesar, his cousin Mark Antony, marries Cleopatra, he gifts her 200,000 scrolls that are going to go into the library to sort of make up for the loss. So we know that whatever portion of the library was burned down, it was very, very, very significant. And the meander ends in the ancient world with the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Whatever that knowledge was, whatever the significance of the meander, completely ceases at that moment. The only other time we see it is on a monument in Rome that's attributed to Augustus. Augustus is the emperor who conquered and annexed Alexandria. And when he was there, have you guys ever heard the quote from Augustus when he says, when I came to Rome, I founded a city of mud bricks and I left it a city of marble? That quote comes because when he arrived in Alexandria, he was so blown away by the architecture and the knowledge in Alexandria, he was inspired by it. And so the very last place that we see this iconography is on a monument dedicated to him after his death. However, we also see it in the Old World, beginning at around 1000 BC at Chalcatsingo. This is an Olmec site. Now, this is not exactly the same as the meanders that you see in the Old World or in the Mediterranean world, but it's going to become exactly the same in generations following the Olmecs. So after this, we have the Mixtec. They existed from about 1400 to 1521. Mixtec and Aztec are very similar, if not the same culture. We also see it at Teotihuacan, which predates the Mixtec Aztec cultures. And so it's very obvious that this is the same pattern, right? As we continue, we also see it even more in the Aztec world. Look at the vase on the top left. Look at the basalt monument at the bottom. Look at the pottery in the middle. This meander pattern is found all throughout the ancient world, and there's no concrete explanation as to what this means. As we continue, we find it at Mitla. Has anyone here ever heard of Mitla before? It's a Zapotec site in Oaxaca, Mexico. We see this, it's the most prevalent at Mitla. And I should add that Mitla is also one of the only places in the Mesoamerican world where you see architecture that is on par with what you see in ancient Egypt. These massive, fine-cut limestone blocks that are about this big, that wide, weigh about 2 tons. Well, they're much bigger than that. They weigh about 1 ton to 2 tons apiece, about the same size as some of the blocks you see on the Great Pyramid, with no mortar in between. And they are built into these labyrinths going all underneath the city of Mitla. So this was truly a remarkable place, and it's the place where we actually see the most prevalence of these meanders. But unfortunately, we just know so little about these cultures, and I'll get to why that is in a second. Then here we have Chichen Itza, which existed between 1200 to 1562, and all around Chichen Itza. If you look up at the top facades of the temples, you're going to see thousands of these meandering patterns everywhere. I have a little group right here that went with me to Mexico just a couple of months ago. And you guys, how many times did I point out, here's the meanders, here's the meanders? Literally everywhere. What I'm showing you guys is is a speck. I mean, we were at some sites in the middle of the jungle, and I walk over and I go, guys, look. The meanders are everywhere. But they end with the burning of the Maya codices in 1562, just like Alexandria. After the burning of the Maya codices, Diego de Landa, who is a conquistador, he gathers all of the Maya books throughout the Mesoamerican world. He stacks them into pyres. Now, a pyre is a small mound, which how many books could I fit in multiple pyres that are this tall? Imagine how much knowledge I could fill. And he lit it all on fire and burned it to ash. And all of the knowledge of the Mesoamerican world that was cultivated by the Maya was burned in 1562. And we know that it was significant because the Aztecs, who were standing on the shoulders of the knowledge of the Maya, we know from Spanish accounts that they were producing 485,000 pieces of paper a year. But the Maya had already been doing that for 2,000 years. And all of that was stacked together and burned in Merida, Mexico, at the hands of Diego de Landa in 1562. After that, the meander is gone. So in 2 places across the world, all the knowledge is burned. Now, we get to a possible explanation for this. So reaching through time and space, the global connection, question mark. So in the Mesoamerican world, I find it really amazing that academics don't attribute more of the culmination of ancient knowledge to the use of psychedelics when the use of psychedelics and the iconography and the effigies of them are so prominent. This is at a museum at La Venta, and these are just 5 of hundreds of different effigies of mushrooms that were being shown, and there were various other psychedelic plants that were shown. And I would ask the archaeologists, you have to pay an archaeologist to give you a tour guide in Mexico. These are INA guys, and they're pretty good. And I ask him, I go, okay, so do you think that the Maya were heavily influenced by psychedelics? And then it's just bizarre to me that the knee-jerk answer is no. I mean, no, not really. It's kind of just shrugged off because it's something that's so hard to prove. It's always shrugged off, but we know through the prevalence of iconography like this. There's mushrooms depicted everywhere. All over the temples in ancient Egypt, you see psychedelic plants behind the pharaohs. And throughout ancient Greece, more and more research is coming out in these little vases that they were spiking their wine with psychedelics. All of these ancient cultures were interacting with psychedelics. And one thing that I think is that a possible potential explanation for why we look at similar places all around the world and we see so many different similarities, and we're trying to draw these webs of these civilizations that existed in two different places at the same time, but how did they communicate with each other when we don't see the archaeological evidence that's connecting us between these two places? I just wonder if a simpler explanation is, say this is the globe, rather than trying to connect all the dots like this, what if the dots connect like this? All of these ancient cultures are tapping into a very similar source. And maybe it's something that's innately human. Maybe it really is a real spiritual world that these people are tapping into and almost absorbing knowledge from. And we see such similar iconography across all of these ancient cultures. And then that takes us to one of my favorite things, the handbags. How many times have we seen that this is depicting people bringing knowledge from one place to the other? Here at Monument 19, we see an Olmec man being carried in the flying feathered serpent. And he's being carried and he's holding the little handbag in front of him. In the middle, we see two Mesopotamian friezes that are almost exactly the same. They're holding the little handbag. The handbag in the Mesopotamian examples and the handbag in the Olmec examples are identical. And when you look at this, the Olmec example is a little bit different. No, it's actually not that much. It's not that much different. But the Olmec right hand is up, the left hand is down, but the right hand is holding the bag. Look at the two Mesopotamian examples where you see the right hand is up, the left hand is down, holding the bag. And then at Göbekli Tepe, we see something that may look like a handbag, But even, guys like Graham Hancock are like, well, maybe this is a handbag. But it's very interesting that this is depicted here. And I had looked at these handbags and I had thought, man, maybe there's something concrete to this, but, I don't know about the Göbekli Tepe example. Maybe if I could just find one more example, if there was one more example out there, I would feel that this was more significant. And I look, and I don't see anything on the internet, and I'm going through the Olmec world, and I found the fourth handbag. This has never been depicted anywhere else. This is the first time any of you guys are seeing this. This was found on a mural at Caverns. Caverns, the only reason that it is still preserved is because the volcano that looms over Caverns erupted in 900 AD and completely buried the city, and it preserved all the murals in the city, exactly like Pompeii. Have you guys ever seen that unspeakably important mosaic of Alexander riding at Darius with the spear, and he's about to throw the spear? Have you guys ever seen this before? That image is only preserved because it was erected at Pompeii. We don't find it in the Greek world. It was created in Pompeii. It was very, very significant. And it was only preserved because that city was covered with ash. Caverns was covered in ash. And if it isn't obvious enough, it's exactly the same. Exactly the same. The left hand is down, the right hand is up, and he's holding a handbag. This comes from Veracruz culture, which is the culture that directly inherited the Olmec culture as well. So we see this being preserved about 2,000 years after the time of the Olmec into much more of a modern time. And there was an archaeologist there who I was with, and I said, hey, this handbag right here, this guy holding this bag, what do you think this is? And this isn't somebody who's tapped into, all the things that we study today. And he's like, oh yeah, it's probably depicting a shaman. That's what people think. And I was like, a shaman. Okay, that makes sense. That's about what I think as well. And so, yeah, these Veracruz archaeologists think that this is depicting a shaman. And so now we have a fourth handbag. And so I firmly believe that somehow this iconography of this left hand down, the right hand up, holding the handbag, and that Veracruz archaeologist, who we have a lot more evidence in Veracruz culture. We know so much more about them than we do about Mesopotamians or the Olmecs. And he deems this as being a shaman. That checks out with what I've been thinking, that these shamans are introducing people in the rest of the world to, rather than connecting cultures all across the world, they are all ascending from this 3D world and tapping into the same thing, and you see the same iconography. You see the same architecture all over the world. They're all tapping into many of the same things. And this is the site of Caverns. You can barely see it, but it's down in that little labyrinth right there, and the guy with the handbag is down there, and I had to ask for special permission to go down the steps to take this photo. But this is the site of Caverns, and it's covered up with a roof, kind of similar to Göbekli Tepe, just to protect it, because the murals are just indescribably valuable. So we get into the last frontier. All throughout the ancient world, Egypt, there's still more things to uncover in Egypt, but it's almost tapped out. It's a pin cushion with no more cushion, or with no room for more pins. Archaeological surveys have torn that country up, and they found most of the monumental architecture. There's definitely still more out there, but most of it has probably been found. And so we constantly hear, and I got to say this, we hear even from Flint Dibble's debate with Graham Hancock as to how we have really good surveys all around the world. We really know. I don't think so. And I've got some examples as to why that is, and I do think that the last frontiers of archaeology are North Central and South America, in the jungles of North Central and South America. So, and I have come to this conclusion just through a pretty long, strenuous amount of exploration in the jungles of Central and North America, and by North America I mean southern Mexico. So this is a drone shot that I took recently, and this is just one of hundreds of other photos that I have of a city that was found way out in Maya farmland. So when I was talking about 20,000 years ago, the Maya and Mesoamerican people are raising maize, they're still doing it today. They're doing it on the exact same land that they always have been. And you go down these long dirt roads for 3 or 4 hours before you get to this area, and then you start looking off and you go, oh, pyramid, 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 pyramid. For hours, you're driving down the road, and there's just cities scattered about. And so this was one of the ones when the sun was starting to go down at the end of the day. I was able to get a bit of a shadow on this city right here. This is not listed on an archaeological site. It would be impossible to list them all, and it would be impossible to determine, is this the same city as this one? There are thousands, tens of thousands of these mound houses and pyramids and structures. And I should also say that my drone is really high. These pyramids are probably just shorter than the size of the ceiling right here, I would say. Another example of what we found is these are these long dirt roads. The reason it's so hard to find a city is because you wouldn't even realize that that's a city sitting next to a dirt road that's covered up by the canopy. It's impossible to see it. The only reason that we knew that it was there was because a local Maya person said, "Oh yeah, when you go down to that three-way, stop and look on the right and hop over the fence, and if you walk around there, you'll see multiple temples and pyramids there." So they're absolutely everywhere. This is outside of the city of Nuevo Palestina. We got high up on the edge, and what can you guys see off in the distance there? It's a triad of pyramids. They call them the Great Pyramids in Chiapas, Mexico as well. Completely unexcavated. There's not even a name for them. They're not even on an archaeological map, but they're right there, and all the locals know about it. Hasn't been excavated. There's no name for it. Now, a city that I'm on the hunt for, and this is something that's going to take me quite a while to prepare, is I'm looking for a city that is described at the Temple of the Lady Satkuk on the outer jungles of Palenque. That's me on the right, sitting next to the temple. And so the facade where the inscriptions were on the temple have been taken off to be preserved. But what it does is it describes the mother of the king Pakal here. Now, Pakal is the most significant of the Maya kings. When he's buried, he was buried with 2 jade figures in his hand. One is a sphere, the other one is a cube. He knew about sacred geometry, square in the circle. I could give a whole other lecture on that. He's the most important Maya king. But he wasn't born in Palenque. He was brought in from a different city with his mother called Lacanha, and he was chosen to be the king of Palenque. That city called Lacanha has never been discovered. But from what I hear from local Maya people, with their suspicion is that it is located right next to the lagoon of Lacanha. So Lacamha and Lacanha. Now that is just southeast of the city of Bonampak into the Lacandon jungle. And some people have heard me talk about this before. But this road that leads to Bonampak is about a 20 or 30-minute drive into the jungle, and there's no more survey done south of this or near the lagoon. Okay, almost done. Done south of this or near the lagoon. And I think that this is really representative of how little we know of the ancient Americas, just this road right here, because that is the rest of the Lacandone jungle that has never been mapped. Okay, the Lacandone jungle is nothing compared to the Petén jungle, where they just discovered a city of 60,000 structures 10 miles into the tree line. Now, this is the Lacandone jungle compared to the Petén jungle that connects Quintana Roo, the rest of Mexico, and Guatemala. Now, the Petén jungle is absolutely nothing compared to the Amazon. The vast only estimates are that 1% of the Amazon has had traditional archaeological surveys being done. And so, okay, wrapping this up, I was really, really excited to announce my first ever Olmec tour. Unfortunately, before I could officially announce it today, my tour of megalithic Mexico is already about to sell out. We have like 2 more spots left. So I'm going to announce the next tour, which is Cleopatra's Egypt. And this is going to be diving into the world of ancient Egypt through the eyes of people collecting knowledge in Alexandria before it was burned down. And I'm really excited to go down this rabbit hole. And next year when I come back to Cosmic, it's going to be something more along these lines of ancient Alexandria and piecing together the unknown parts of the ancient world. So anyways, I'm Luke Caverns. Thank you guys so much.
So in this video, I'm going to present to you a number of astonishing archaeological discoveries made over the last century pertaining to the very mysterious origins of Mesoamerican history, of which the vast majority of Mesoamerican history was destroyed or burned at the hands of Diego de Landa in the mid-1500s in the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, I'm going to make a plethora of videos covering the lost history and lost knowledge of many different cultures in the ancient Americas, but today we're going to be focusing on the Olmecs, who are largely presented as being the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They existed between 1600 and 300 BC and largely set the stage for Mesoamerica as a whole. And I also want to state that while I do believe that the ancient monumental feats of ancient cultures may have been completed in a way differing from what we're told by academia, I do believe that all of these ancient megalithic sites around the world were in fact built by the ancient people who lived there. So most commonly, the Olmecs are known for their giant megalithic stone heads, the Olmec heads. These are a collection of 17 solid basalt blocks found in the ancient swamps of central Mexico, which would be modern-day Veracruz, Tabasco, and Puebla, Mexico. These heads weigh anywhere from 6 to 40 tons, and they're carved into portraits of the ancient Olmec kings they depict. Unfortunately though, these Olmec heads tell us as little as they do a lot about the Olmecs, meaning that they bring up as many or way more questions than they do answers. What we do know is that these Olmec heads were quarried more than 50 miles from the sites they were discovered, down rushing rivers and through swampy mountainous terrain. So let's start with a brief overview of who the Olmecs were and put them in their time and place. The Olmecs name is derivative of the Nahuatl language used by the Aztecs for describing a land and people further to the east of Tenochtitlan, people of the rubber country, as ancient rubber is found in that area. Mesoamerican rubber trees, known as the Castilla elastica, were harvested by nearly all high cultures of Mesoamerica. Surprisingly, even with modern archaeological discoveries, we still don't know the actual true name of the Olmecs or what they called themselves, so we have to be contented for now with the designation that the Aztecs gave to that area. But that was in the 14 to 1500s. More than 300 years would go by before anyone in the modern era would discover the remnants of these Olmec people. The Aztecs themselves may not even have had knowledge of the Olmecs beyond various jade artifacts in the Aztec possession that they had found, or perhaps had been passed down through various cultures, since the time of the Olmecs was more than 2,000 years before the Aztecs. Unfortunately, we will likely never know for certain if the Aztecs may have had a direct knowledge of the Olmecs, due to the fact that more than 99% of all written Mesoamerican history was burned in pyres, which means small mounds or heaps of stacked Aztec and Maya books. This was done as a result of the Spanish attempts to convert the native people to Christianity by burning their written history, tearing down their monuments, and extinguishing their religion and culture. This leaves us in a place where we have to use the little remaining evidence and a whole lot of detective work to piece back ancient Mesoamerica's history. But unfortunately, due to the widespread book burning from the Maya heartland to the Aztec heartland, we will likely never know the full history in its entirety. But according to the archaeological evidence, what do we know of the ancient Olmecs' knowledge of astronomy, architecture, transportation, religion, and ancient technology? So in 1925, the Olmec capital of La Venta was officially discovered in the Mexican state of Tabasco. One of the most peculiar archaeological finds of this site are the megalithic stone columns found beneath the plazas at La Venta. These are hardly known about outside of the academic world. Ancient history enthusiasts rarely know of these megalithic burials. Beneath La Venta's Complex A, Burial Tomb A, Monument 7, is believed to have been constructed sometime between 700 and 400 BC and is made out of extremely large basalt columns assembled into a caged chamber tomb of sorts, with a solid limestone floor. When I first saw this tomb in person, I'd never seen or heard of it before or really seen anything like it, and I was actually shocked at its scale. The ceiling columns were well over my head, and the size of the columns was as shocking as the size of the Olmec heads and altars I had seen as well. The royal figure buried within this tomb was nowhere to be found when the tomb was discovered, as the acidic soil had completely dissolved the organic material. But what was found were jade ceremonial and funerary objects that were completely covered in cinnabar. Now, cinnabar and jade are not natural to the Olmec heartland. This indicates the immense power, connections, and wealth that the Olmecs must have had to commission not only the construction of a monument like this, but to have access to riches such as fine jade that could only be found in the Maya regions of Guatemala or Belize at that time. Also found in this tomb was a mysterious magnetite mirror. These Olmec mirrors and jade objects that they produced were of a quality of polish far exceeding anything that any other culture or civilization had achieved at that time. Furthermore, these basalt columns were not quarried nearby the city of La Venta. They had to have come from more than 50 miles away, where the nearest volcanic deposits were found in the Sierra de la Tuxtla volcanic belt of modern-day Veracruz. And yet again, this alludes to the immense power and wealth of Olmec rulers to commission and successfully complete such backbreaking work over the course of hundreds or maybe thousands of years. Furthermore, you have to consider what were the technological means and ingenious methods that were used to transport these stone columns from the basalt quarries to La Venta. This is something that we'll touch on throughout this video. And apart from the stone column tombs, monuments, and Olmec heads, there is another form of megalithic art and architecture taken on by the Olmecs, and that is the altars. Or at least that is what Matthew Sterling, an early and influential archaeologist in the Olmec world, proposed them to be. These are enormous rectangular basalt monuments decorated with glyphs and depictions of Olmec people or potentially rulers. In the case of the large scene at Altar 4 in La Venta, it appears to depict a man emerging from a cave or even a portal of some sort. This may be a reference to early Olmec civilization emerging from caves in southern Mexico, as archaeological findings are increasingly pointing to Mesoamerican civilization having its roots in the emergence from caves. Or it may be representing a man emerging from a psychedelic, shamanic state. The Olmecs were very likely using hallucinogenic psychedelics for religious rituals, in which they would seemingly become something like a were-jaguar figure, half man, half jaguar, similar to what we understand as the concept of a werewolf. These half-breed humans are seen all throughout Olmec art and architecture. This particular altar weighs at least 33 tons and was likely hauled to the site before being carved, meaning that the original stone weighed significantly more, likely north of 40 tons. Again, the means by which this altar and the other 13 discovered altars were transported is not known, and how the Olmecs transported the stones used to carve these monuments across rivers, swamps, and mountain ranges is not known either. Furthermore, these altars may have also acted as thrones in which Olmec rulers sat upon. This idea comes from a fragmented monument found at San Lorenzo that depicts the lower half of what is likely a ruler seated upon a rectangular throne. Archaeologists theorize that the carved ropes are depicting a seated ruler sitting upon a stone altar or throne being pulled by his subjects. So, not entirely unlike the ancient Roman or Greek mosaics found in the Old World, thousands of tons of ancient Olmec greenstone was found buried meters deep beneath the plazas at La Venta. These green stones, shaped like ancient Mesoamerican axe heads, were arranged in mosaic patterns depicting Olmec gods or the face of the Olmec dragon depicted on Monument 19 in the same city. This is also seen as the earliest depiction of the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica, also known as Kukulkan to the Maya and Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs. And with the depiction of the feathered serpent being so intricate among the Olmecs, who already predate the classic Maya by nearly 2,000 years, it is very likely that the worship of the feathered or plumed serpent goes back even further than the classic Olmec era. Thus far, there have been 5 Olmec mosaic floors found, and the largest of them was found comprised of 28 layers of mosaic floors, weighing in at least several thousand tons. To give you an idea of that weight, the stone of the pregnant woman at Baalbek is over 1,200 tons. It's thought that these mosaics are potentially meant to be offerings to the Olmec gods, and stacked together, these mosaics are enormous works of art, which are inexplicably buried by the Olmecs themselves. Another mysterious buried offering cache is known formally as Offering 4. Which depicts a scene of 16 human figures with seemingly elongated skulls standing around a miniature stela. 15 of the 16 figures were carved in jade, while the central figure himself was carved from sandstone. This may be a depiction of an ancient ritual taking place, or perhaps a king standing in front of his stela addressing the public or his subjects. It is a symbolic peek of some kind into the Olmec world and Olmec way of life, but we just don't have the written context to fully understand what may have been taking place here. As for why the Olmecs may have buried their own monuments, mosaics, and burial caches, this may have been a selfless symbolic act of giving up their most valuable items or constructing something that takes a significant amount of time and then burying it as a sacrifice to their gods. Or maybe it was an act of burying their past to symbolically move forward. I'm reminded a bit of the speculations as to whether or not Göbekli Tepe in ancient Turkey was intentionally buried, and if so, what is that purpose? The Olmecs and the inhabitants of Göbekli Tepe were both, in a way, the progenitors of civilization within their respective areas, and they both may have intentionally buried their monuments either as a large sacrifice to their gods, or perhaps as a symbolic burying of their past as they move forward. This is actually well observed in the Maya world, where the Maya people will remove the statued head of past rulers as a ritualistic and symbolic goodbye to their past. It may have also been that ancient Mesoamericans such as the Maya or the Olmecs felt that the spiritual essence of rulers continued to live beyond their death within their own monuments. Perhaps defacing, burying, or beheading their monuments was a way of capturing, releasing, or even harnessing that spirit. These are things that we just really don't quite know yet. And these are things that may never be fully understood. And if you're starting to see a trend here in Mesoamerica, it's that we only know a very limited amount about these ancient people. Finally, that brings us to the Olmec pyramids, which not many people even know that the Olmec built pyramids. With the presence of colossal basalt heads, altars, giant monuments, and stela, not many people realize that the Olmecs actually built pyramids. The problem here is that all of the officially recognized Olmec pyramids are actually earthen structures similar to mounds. These pyramids have been grown over and their original features are just lost to time, which prevents archaeologists from being able to faithfully reconstruct the site, and it also prevents archaeologists from being able to identify potential cosmological alignments that the Olmecs may have recognized and aligned their structures to. However, a recent discovery made in Puebla, Mexico has revealed several ancient Mesoamerican ball courts, ceremonial centers, and even the potential base of a stone pyramid believed to have been built by the Olmecs. If this is proven true, it would be the first stone Olmec pyramid ever discovered and likely the oldest stone pyramid from Mesoamerica thus far. Furthermore, with the stone angles preserved, we may also be able to determine the pyramid's celestial alignments, if there are any, to see if the Olmecs revered some of the same astronomical bodies as the later Maya and other cultures would. This could play quite a large part in how we understand the extent of astronomical knowledge in Mesoamerica, as well as highlighting just how far back this knowledge goes. Likely, if the Olmecs were constructing stone pyramids aligned to bodies in the night sky, this extensive knowledge of astronomy would go back even further than the Olmecs. Now, this is just a side note, but I also want to add that among all of the Mesoamerican innovations that are attributed to the Olmecs, the Mesoamerican ball game also likely finds its origins in Olmec society. And the only eyewitness accounts that we have of the Mesoamerican ball game come from early Spanish chroniclers who visited the Aztecs in the mid-1500s. They chronicled the immense skill, danger, and deep cultural ties and traditions around the Mesoamerican ball game. Using only their rear and knees, Aztec ball players could bounce a solid, very heavy rubber ball back and forth for over an hour without missing a beat, while being in imminent danger of being hit in the wrong way by the rubber ball. One account details a ball player taking a noticeably hard hit to the stomach, going to sit down, and then dying just an hour later, likely due to internal organ eruption. The Mesoamerican ball was roughly the size of a modern-day volleyball, but it weighed anywhere from 6 to at least 10 pounds. So getting hit to the head or stomach could have and often did result in death for some players. Interestingly though, the rubber that the Aztecs used for these balls came from the Olmec heartland, hence why the Aztecs called the people from that area rubber people, or people from the land of rubber. In 1862, a farmer by the name of Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano made the very first discovery of a colossal Olmec head. It was not widely publicized or reported on outside of Mexico, and it would unfortunately not be until 1938 when Matthew Stirling would come to perform a proper excavation of the stone head. And this incredible discovery and excavation would spark a rush of investigations, excavations, and research into the Olmec world. But initially, researchers had no idea that these monuments were the work of an entirely different civilization from the Maya or other recognized Mesoamerican cultures, let alone that these discoveries were considerably more ancient than any of the others. But as excavation and research continued throughout the 20th century, it became overwhelmingly apparent that these megalithic monuments were the work of a high culture that predated any other known established ancient civilization in Mesoamerica. And they were given the designation Olmec as a result of the name that the Aztecs had given to the area in which the heads were later found. But what makes the ancient Olmec civilization so enigmatic, and how does it capture the imagination and curiosity of archaeologists, independent researchers, and enthusiasts all over the world? Well, the Olmec are thus far the first accepted example of ancient megalithic architecture in all of the ancient Americas. Yes, there are ancient Andean sites in South America like Tiwanaku, Machu Picchu, Sacsayhuaman, and Cusco, whose megalithic architecture rivals or dwarfs some of these Olmec monuments, but the many theories of their great antiquity dating back over 10 to 15,000 years has not yet been proven, and they are still believed by archaeologists and academics alike to be considerably younger than these Olmec sites. So the Olmec heads are carved from a volcanic rock called basalt. Currently, there are 17 Olmec heads known to exist, with many more likely buried beneath ancient south-central Mexico. The smallest head, Monument 4 at San Lorenzo, weighs at least 6 tons, with the largest head, the La Cobada head, weighing in at over 40 tons. These stone heads are believed to be portraits of the kings or rulers who commissioned them, and the size may be indicative of each king's immense power. Furthermore, as stated earlier, the ability to quarry the stones for these monuments from over 50 miles away through mountainous terrain, swamps, and rushing rivers necessitates the need for an immense amount of power to commission the workforce, as well as a tremendous amount of knowledge in regards to transporting massive stone boulders through the diverse terrain. perhaps most considerably, they needed the knowledge and ability to build rafts or boats equipped enough to carry this tremendous amount of weight. And oddly, in a very similar manner to the explanation given as to how the ancient Egyptians moved the rose granite blocks from the Aswan Quarry to the Giza Plateau by riverboat, the same half-baked explanation is given here. Now, I should clarify that I don't think there's some grand ancient lost technology conspiracy that's being hidden from us by Mexican archaeologists. I just think that they legitimately do not have a way to explain this. We assume that it's very likely that they did in fact move these Olmec heads up and down the central South Mexican rivers using some kind of riverboat, but we just don't have any surviving examples of what these boats looked like or how they were constructed. I should also add that all of these monuments were very likely carved on the sites that they were discovered at, meaning that they hadn't been carved before they were transported, so they weighed significantly more while they were being transported than they do today. In a very interesting episode of Dr. Ed Barnhart's podcast ArchaeoEd titled The Olmecs, he gives a story of his Olmec Heartland travels with a nautical engineer who developed a software that would allow you to plug in the size of your theoretical Olmec head as well as the size of the balsa river raft said to have been used by the Olmecs to transport their monuments. And what they found was that even if you made a wooden raft 50 feet wide, an Olmec head over 5 tons would sink the raft. And again, the smallest head is just 6 tons, with the largest head being over 40 tons. There are alternative theories as to how Olmec rafts may have been constructed, but theory will only take us so far. None of the theories being provided by academics or independent researchers alike have ever been attempted to be proven right or wrong. And as an interesting side note, I've never seen anyone else theorize this, but I do believe that other Mesoamerican cultures were at least somewhat aware of their Olmec ancestors. On the southern coast of Guatemala, more than 300 miles as the crow flies from the Olmec heartland of Veracruz, another colossal stone head can be found, built by an entirely separate culture, the Pipil Maya peoples. It's my theory that these people were likely somehow aware of the giant Olmec heads, perhaps by way of travel or stories that they had heard from travelers coming through the Central American area, and wanted to build their own similar monuments. Now, this example is just one of several other colossal post-Olmec stone heads found throughout Central America, of which I believe are very likely inspired directly by the Olmecs. I don't know if that's a popular theory among academics, but I personally think it's likely. The Olmecs had an immense impact on the way of life in Mesoamerica, and the mysteries of their methods of quarrying, transporting, and carving these massive basalt monuments still baffles researchers and academics today. Finally, there is great speculation among the archaeological community that not only was the idea of divine kingship spread from the Olmec heartland throughout Mesoamerica, but that the Mesoamerican or Maya calendar may also have its origins in Olmec knowledge and tradition. Now, concrete evidence for this claim has not been substantiated by considerable evidence thus far, but the use of a proto-bar and dot writing system, which was prevalently used by the Maya to record dates and events, may have been found at an archaeological site in Tabasco, Mexico, the San Andres glyphs, carbon dated to about 650 BC. These seem to depict a bird speaking. The speech glyphs are logograms that have been seen in other areas of later Mesoamerican sites. Recognized is the logogram for king and the number 3, and the commonly seen designation ahau, meaning ruler. Likely these glyphs are an example of a very early writing of an Olmec king's name using a number system very similar to the same number system seen widely used among the Maya around 700 to 1000 years later. As research continues, more evidence may in fact prove the origins of the Maya calendar and Mesoamerican calendar and numerology system lie deep within the remote history of Olmec civilization. So, although it seems like many of the Olmec monuments, colossal heads, and lost cities have already been discovered, there is still so much left to uncover about one of Mesoamerica's progenitor civilizations. We still do not know where exactly the Olmecs came from, if they were indigenous to that area or if they migrated from elsewhere in Mesoamerica. We also don't have an exact picture or understanding of their writing and numerology systems, as stated before. Some archaeological finds have given us a glimpse into the fact that they certainly understood an early form of writing and numerology, but the quote-unquote Rosetta Stone of Olmec civilization is still yet to be found. We also do not fully understand the religion, the concept of a were-jaguar, their use of psychedelics, or the origin of Mesoamerica's fabled plumed or feathered serpent, also known as Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl. Similar to the Maya, we don't exactly know why their civilization ended or why they may have defaced and buried their own monuments. We also don't have a clear understanding of their astrology. However, perhaps this new, potentially Olmec stone pyramid will shed some light and show us if the Olmecs constructed their buildings to align with solar cycles. And finally, in 2020, it was reported that archaeological teams in Tabasco, Mexico had uncovered an ancient 1-mile-long structure at the archaeological site of Aguada Phoenix near the Guatemalan border. It is the oldest monumental construction ever found in the Maya region, believed to date back to at least 1000 BC, which is over 1,500 years before the height of the Maya Classic period. This may actually turn out to be another capital of the Olmec world, even further east than archaeologists had ever imagined that the Olmecs had gone. And as excavations continue, we may find ourselves living through the discovery of more Olmec heads, altars, monuments, column tombs, and Olmec treasures. Okay, so I should probably address the polarizing elephant in the room surrounding fringe theories of Olmec origins, namely the idea that the Olmecs actually descended from ancient African seafarers that settled in the Veracruz area and taught the Mesoamerican people how to farm, build, architecture, and write. This theory is almost entirely based on the observation that Olmec heads have big round faces, broad noses, and broad lips. Plus, some theorists try to say that Mesoamerican crops like maize appear in Africa prior to Columbian contact. But that is just not true. The truth is, the Olmec heads look exactly like the descendants of the Olmec people who still live in Olmec heartland today. They too have big round faces, broad noses, and big lips. And absolutely zero detection of African DNA has been found in any forensic archaeological research done in respect to the Olmecs. However, not all fringe theories can be so easily dismissed. As depicted on Monument 13 from La Venta, we see what appears to be a bearded man walking or wearing a turban and carrying a flag. The interesting thing to note here is that the Olmecs and other Native Americans in general were notorious for being completely unable to grow facial hair. They also did not wear turbans. Looking at the foot glyph carved next to him, this has been interpreted as meaning the traveler. This same man may also be seen on other monuments around La Venta as well, such as Monument 63, depicting perhaps the same man beneath what seems to be a shark. And despite the Olmecs' close proximity to the coastline, there isn't any evidence at all that points towards the Olmec being a seafaring civilization going out further into the Gulf Coast. Furthermore, a clay rendering at the Olmec side of Tres Zapotes depicts a bearded man with a pointy goatee-style beard wearing what is very likely yet another turban that is not interpreted as being his hair. These enigmas cause even the most conservative archaeologists to scratch their beards and wonder what these monuments could be trying to tell us. And even more adventurous researchers entertain the idea of Mediterranean influences arriving on the Gulf coast of Mexico, the Phoenicians. During the height of the Phoenician seafaring days, they were sailing all the way around the coast of Africa and back, and this time period lasted between 1500 and 300 BC, exactly the same time as Olmec reign in Mesoamerica. Some research has even proven that if an ancient boat traveled too far west of the Strait of Gibraltar out of the Mediterranean Sea without turning south towards the African coastline, they could be pulled by deep ocean currents into the Atlantic Ocean and down into the Caribbean into the Gulf Coast. Now, we don't have any evidence for Phoenician visitors in the ancient Caribbean or Maya territories of the Yucatan Peninsula, but the civilizations living in these areas also hadn't yet developed writing systems. Perhaps someday more archaeological excavations will either prove or disprove this theory. The first head is discovered by Jose Maria Selgar y Serrano. in the 1860s, I believe. Franz Blom, an explorer from the 1920s, discovers statues at the top of the Tushla Mountains that haven't been attributed to any known culture. They don't quite look Maya. They don't quite look Aztec. They don't quite look Zapotec or Toltec. It's something new that he's discovered with a people with facial features that look much, much different than anything seen anywhere else. Matthew Sterling then discovers other heads and numerous monuments at San Lorenzo and La Venta. Now, Matthew Sterling was like one of the luckiest explorers, archaeologists of all time. Typically, the way it goes with explorers and archaeologists is you have people who spend their entire lives looking for something and they never find anything. And then you have one guy who finds all of it. And Matthew Sterling was kind of that he was that kind of guy where he could go on an expedition all day long and not find anything, come back to these little Veracruz huts that he's staying at, and then go on a walk really frustrated. And he believed in connecting to the earth, so walking around barefooted, and he would stub his toe on an Olmec head. And he did that twice, actually. So he discovers numerous Olmec heads, and then his wife, Marion Thompson, who eventually becomes Marion Sterling, determines that the Olmecs predate the Maya through the stela at Tres Zapotes. So she was able to decipher the prehistoric and pre-Maya hieroglyphs that were on a stela found at Tres Zapotes, and she finally confirmed that the Olmecs are the oldest known civilization in Mesoamerica. Which that whole story, so far, yes, yeah. There's a proto-Olmec civilization, they think, but if we were to research it, it would be deep down inside of these caves, which we'll get to, in Guerrero, Mexico, which is one of the most dangerous places to go. So there were some researchers, some young, I think PhD students that went out there, and they were studying, I want to say, plant and animal life next to one of the lakes that are at these proto-Olmec sites, and they were murdered by gangs that are down there. So it's a tough place to do any research at. Okay. All right, so we're going to do a crash course of what has been found. Let's see.
Right.
So Nicholas says, did they find more than just heads? Yes.
It looks like Flintstones, that does.
Yeah, it does.
Flintstones house.
Yes, they found a lot more than just heads. So here we go. So column tombs. Each of these, have you ever seen anything like this before?
No, like I said, for me, it looks like a Flintstones house.
Yeah.
They're kind of, it's like a kind of tomb-shaped box, but made of individual cut stone.
Yeah, they are cylindrical. The Snake Bros had a better word for them, but they are, they're cylindrical, hexagonal, volcanic.
Similar to like
cylinders.
Gunung Padang.
Very similar, basically exactly the same thing. And ancient cultures identified these as, basically Lincoln logs that they could use, except very, very strenuous Lincoln logs that they then decided to haul 90 kilometers away to the site that they wanted to live at, which was near the Coetzalcoatl River. So you can just imagine they begin doing this in about 3,500 years ago. And so they had this giant thriving civilization along the Coetzalcoatl River. And what made the Olmecs so successful and so dominant over Mesoamerica was the fact that they had the main river that was right in the middle of all the trade networks in ancient Mexico or ancient Mesoamerica. So they had that main river, and they had essentially streamlined and capitalized maize corn production. So it's exactly the same thing that makes Egypt so monumental, is that they're living along the Nile. They have all the agriculture, therefore they have all the power, therefore they become the first civilization. It's the same thing with the Olmecs. So they have these trade networks that go up 90 miles away to the Sierra de la Tuxtla Mountains, and they're hauling all of these basalts. This is also made out of basalt monuments. So there's so much more than the Olmec heads that they haul 90 kilometers through the jungles, swamps, mountain ranges, across rivers. We're going to get into a lot of it. So anyways, yeah. Oh my God. So they're quarried from the Cerro Sintepec region in the Tuxtla Mountains over 80 kilometers away. And no bodies have ever been found inside what they think are these tombs due to the acidic soil. Like if you bury something, and you come back 3,000 years later, not even the bone will be left.
It's going to be
However,
eaten.
however, there's a sarcophagus that we're going to get to that they even found a sarcophagus, and we're pretty certain that it was a sarcophagus, but there was no body inside of it. It's very
Of
strange.
course, obviously, because they
Exactly.
never do.
And so here's another one of these columns that looks like it was cracked, although maybe it was cut somewhere in the middle, but this is estimated to be about 15 to 20 tons. And so you have to imagine there are thousands of these that are being hauled. So imagine when I show you an Olmec head that is anywhere from 20 to 40, all of them are anywhere from around 10 to 40 tons. That's nothing compared to the amount of these column tombs, or the amount of these columns that they're hauling somehow. It's nothing compared to this weight. So they also find jade artifacts and iron ore mirrors. These are also found in the column tombs, reportedly the most finely polished artifacts in all of Mesoamerica, oldest mirrors known in the Americas that are most finely polished anywhere in the Americas, and jade figurines depicting Olmec people with elongated skulls. So after this, we have what most people aren't aware of are megalithic altar/thrones. These are potentially depicting a shaman or oracle emerging from a cave or a portal. Remember how I was saying earlier that the proto-Olmecs can be found in Guerrero, Mexico, inside of these caves?
Yeah.
Well, this is where we think that the Olmec civilization descended from, that at some point more than 5,000 years ago, they were living inside of caves, and that's how their civilization began. And there's something significant and ritualistic about emerging from a cave. When you look at all of their monuments, they're always going to be kind of coming out of this portal, and sometimes they're even holding babies. So carved after being transported 80 plus kilometers. So you see this one that on the top right, that's altar 4, that's 44 tons finished.
Yep.
So right off next to that, they discovered that just the giant blocks that they cut off the side and just tossed it off into the jungle. They discovered the little parts of that monument that would fit next to it. So it would have been 50 plus tons before they carved it. They just
A 50-ton big box.
Yep, a 50-ton giant box. And sometimes depicting a child were-jaguar being carried by a shaman. And we'll get way more into this were-jaguar thing, because this is kind of a half global phenomenon. When I say half global, I mean North America and South America. You see these images of people turning into this god feline. It's this half human. It's like a werewolf, but it's a jaguar person. And could have been an altar to worship the king sitting on the throne. So they don't really know if it's altars or thrones, or if it's just both. And child were-jaguar could be the king's claim to his shamanic power and kingship. But there's a couple problems with, if this were-jaguar or these shamans that are emerging from the portals, if that is supposed to depict the king, then why do the Olmec heads look nothing like them? It's like two different species of humans that we see in the Olmec world. So the next thing we see are these giant mosaic floors. They're roughly 15 by 20 feet long, and they consist of up to 485 blocks of serpentine. And I believe that's per level, but I could be wrong about that. And comes from the Sierra de la Tuxtla region and Guatemala. So they were actually commissioning this serpentine stone. This isn't something that's found in their own region. So they have enough power to purchase this from other cultures who are mining it up for them and then sending it to them. So one mosaic floor consists of 28 layers. So they found 5 of these things. So it's 28 layers, just like the pattern that you see here on the right.
Yeah.
It's 28 layers of that. All together, they weigh more than 1,000 tons, and they were all constructed and buried at the same time.
Wait, hold on. Sorry, just gonna go head around this. So it's 28 layers on top of like a cake, like a 28 layer cake mosaic.
Yes.
That's weird, because what's the point? Because you only get to see the top layer of the mosaic, like visually.
Well, you couldn't even see that because they buried it.
That's weird. So it's like a big Jenga, building a massive Jenga stack and then burying it.
Burying the whole thing. And it all happened at one time. It wasn't 28 different periods of time. It was all very quickly. And they know that by excavating. I spoke to a geologist there who kind of explained it to me. And he said any geologist, if you were to make a pit and you were to look at the soil, it is the most obvious thing to tell if it was all buried at the same time. He had a better way of explaining it, but I believed him, and that's kind of the consensus among people who research these giant mosaic floors. So what they think that it might be is some kind of monumental sacrifice to either an ancestor or a god of some kind, that they're making these mosaic floors that no one is going to see but some kind of heavenly being. And they think it might even be like an earth god, or like the Maya call it the Wheats monster, which is the god of the god of the ground, or the god of the mountain, or the mountain monster. They think that it may even be to acknowledge him. So they're basically giving him a sacrifice. I saw a cool comment here. Somebody said 28 like moon cycles. Exactly like that. Everything. Mesoamericans were the greatest astronomers that the ancient world has ever seen. I mean, maybe only rivaled by Mesopotamia and potentially Egypt in some places, and the Greeks when they were in Egypt, but probably not eclipsed by any other culture in the ancient world. And so, yes, there's so many different lenses to look at artifacts and different mysteries in Mesoamerica, but you're going to see the number 28 pop up a lot. So
probably because they're tracking the menstrual cycles. These women going, you know what? I'm going to log it.
They definitely are. And they're definitely noticing. I couldn't even think of everything off the top of my head, but how many cycles are based on 28 days? I mean,
yeah,
snakes shedding their skin. It's just, it goes on and on and on and on. I think that snakes shed their skin on a 28-day cycle. I don't know if it's every 28 days, but it is a 28-day cycle, I believe. So burial caches and mosaics. So this one's pretty interesting. So there's 15 jade figurines and one red stone figurine. He's in the back and he's kind of halfway covered up. He's in the back in the middle. Flanked by 6 stelae, also 6 stelae found at Levinta that are at the base of the Great Pyramid of Levinta. And I will sort of explain this procession that's going on when we get there. Figurines depict a ceremony or procession of some kind. This is basically like a screenshot of Olmec society. So there's something really important happening here. They basically have taken a screenshot of it, but without any of the context or literary evidence of what this used to be. But whatever they're depicting is something that was actually happening. This is kind of something that you don't really see at all in the ancient world.
Like a photo. It looks like Fight Club. Or maybe it was Olmec Fight Club. They're all, for anyone who's just listening, it's a bunch of jade figurines that look like kind of very, very early prototype action men. And they're all stood in various, sort of like a circle. They're like in a group with kind of 6 dolmen type Stonehenge things but in the background.
Yep.
And and they've got like kind of crosses on their back that looks like they're wearing swords. Maybe it's like a pre-battle plan, bro.
Well, those are actually just wires, I think, that are meant to hold them up.
Oh, right, maybe not.
Yeah. So Beetlejuice says those are literally looking like Easter Island statues in mini form. Johanna's going to Easter Island this year.
I am, but they do actually, don't they? Because they got such big heads.
Yeah. The idea is, I saw Dr. Barnhart on a video on Wired. If you're familiar with that YouTube channel, he was just on Wired recently, and he was talking about how Mesoamericans may have been elongating their skulls to. I think everyone pretty much agrees with this, that they were elongating their own skulls as like a status symbol. But it's just amazing that
look at my big brain.
Yeah, you see these guys with elongated skulls here. There's so much to unpack about the Olmecs with elongated skulls, but you see these guys here with elongated skulls. You see it in ancient Peru. You see it in Easter Island. We could do a whole episode just on that, because the people from Easter Island supposedly landed on Easter Island coming from Polynesia, and they hadn't quite made their way to Peru yet. But it's very clear that those monoliths on Easter Island have elongated skulls, I would say.
Yeah, elongated everything.
When is Easter? I'm not an expert on Easter Island, but when are they said to have constructed those? Is it AD or is it BC?
I think it's AD. I think it's they're like about 1,000 1,600 years old. I'm gonna let's give that a quick Google because
Anybody know in the comments when
Albert
the Moai statues are?
um
So Beetlejuice says 100 AD.
yeah so it's between, but the Rapa Nui carvers create some 900 between roughly 1,100 AD and 1650, like super recently apparently.
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. That it seems like in the
Yeah, like
Americas.
1,000 years ago. They're about that. Well, supposedly 1,000 years old, yet buried up to their necks,
Mm-hmm.
and the
Yeah.
entire ground, like not just around the statue, the entire landscape has been filled in. Do you know what they would have to fill in, like entire mountainsides just to get them up
Oh
to
yeah.
their?
Yeah.
I don't think they were made 1,000 years ago. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, so that's kind of the thing, is that in the ancient Americas, almost everything is AD. Almost everything. It sort of the ancient Americas. It seems like they really start hitting their height around 200 AD, and from Central America, even all the way up in North America, Mississippian, Chaco Canyon, the Four Quarters region, or the Four Corners, because you have the Inca world as well. But all the way down to South America, they all start hitting their height around 800 AD. And so that's kind of one of the things that's strange about the Olmecs. You see their elongated heads here. This is 3,500 years ago is what we're looking at right now, roughly. And they look so similar to the Moai statues, but the Moai statues are supposedly 2,000-ish years later and are
No.
not
Do you know what
heads.
the Moai statue? Somebody sent me something recently, actually, which kind of blew my mind. You know, some of the really recent human statues that they're digging up in Karahan Tepe in Turkey, which is older, 1,000 years older than Göbekli Tepe. Well, filled in 1,000 years older, just to say. There is some human statues coming out of Karahan that are so similar to the Moai, like the hand placements, the hips, the ribs. It's like, and these are obviously, Karahan is like, you cannot dispute the age of them. They are 12,000 years old, and the fact that they are the human statues in Turkey and the ones on Easter Island, yet they are supposedly, there's a 10,000 year difference between the two, and it's odd. It's very odd. Like the ones I got sent through to my email, I was like, okay, I'm going to go up close and check this out later this year when I go to Easter Island. But there's just too much similarity. I really feel like there's some sort of bond between ancient Turkey and Easter Island.
Very interesting. Yeah, you'll have to send me some photos of that.
I will send you it, because it's like, it's the new stuff that's coming out of Turkey that looks like stuff on Easter Island. And I'm like, okay.
Well, we'll have to do an episode recapping your trip.
Yeah, we will.
When you get back. So, anyways, yeah. So, look very much like what we see on Easter Island, but not thought to have any connection whatsoever, and up to around 2,000 years difference. So, statues and stelae. So you see these two twin statues that are here on the left. Those were found on the top of the Sierra de la Tuxtla Mountains, just sitting up at the top. And a guy named Franz Blom, he's one of the guys that Indiana Jones is based on, climbs to the top of that mountain with a few local indigenous people who are probably descendants of Olmecs as well. And they showed him these statues that are sitting up there. And he's the first one to document it and bring it to the Western world. So they say he discovered it. There's a funny joke that's like, we have all these ideas of these Victorian English explorers trotting off into the jungle, and they're like, look at what I discovered with my little friend who told me where it was.
It's like, yeah.
So,
but hold on, let me just describe this again. So it's two statues in a very weird position, because they look like they're sitting on their knees, but they're leaning forward to support their weight on their forearms, like kind of gorilla pose, I'd call it. And then they've got like the big round sort of Olmec-y head and helmet, but then on top of them, from what I look, it looks like a pharaoh's hat.
Yes, it does.
Right?
Doesn't
It's even got the stripes at the side of what like a kind of pharaoh's headdress with the stripy side, sort of like ear flaps. We'll call them that. Very unusual pose. Not my favorite. I mean, I don't think it's the most flattering.
No.
I wouldn't want my statue. like
Yeah.
that.
So these are called the twins. They're found on two different mountaintops facing each other. And
Whoa.
they're found on mountaintops that are about 90 kilometers away from the Olmec heartland. And so there's not really an explanation as to why they're on these mountains. We have no idea what the significance of these two mountains where these two twins are sitting on and facing each other. And what's interesting is that, oh man, the snakes, they brought this up at one point as well, and maybe you'd be more familiar with this reference. But if you see, it looks like they are grabbing the staff and that they are lifting it. Have you ever heard of this motion before? It's like, man, somebody in the comments might know. It's something that the snakes are interested in, that they study, that they said it looks very similar to, but it's not something that I study. Maybe somebody in the comments will recognize.
Raising the staff. Okay, yeah, they're kind of
Raising the
like
staff, yeah,
their hands.
exactly
Oh
what
yeah,
they
because actually they've got one. Now I look at it, they've got what, like their left hand is kind of gripping under a stick, and the right hand is gripping, or the other way around. So it looks like they're about to start kicking ass with some sort of stick.
That's what it looks like. Furthermore, those headdresses that you said look sort of pharaonic.
Mhm.
Never just like the pharaoh headdresses. So you have
Like
the headset, you have the
just.
white crown, you have the red crown, you have the headdress that comes flowing down, you have the Egyptian beards.
Yes.
None of those have ever been discovered, and no Olmec headdresses, which we're going to get into, which some of them look. It's just amazing that there's a few different types of Olmec headdresses that
Mhm.
all look it. Well, I say there's a few different types that look Egyptian, and
Mhm.
neither Olmec or neither Egyptian headdresses, none of them have ever been found. We have no idea what they were made of. We don't know what colors they were. So that's fascinating in itself. So, anyways, they depict were-jaguar children with cleft-lipped were-jaguar people. So if you were to go up to them, you can see that they would have these like cleft lips. You've seen the deformity of cleft lips before.
Oh yeah, yeah, many
That's what
many people have it.
we think that it may have been a common genetic deformity in the Olmec people, and that it had some kind of, I don't know, they gave it some kind of divine understanding.
Yeah,
That,
maybe they thought it was like a blessed child who was born with a cleft.
well, that seems to be something that's pretty common in Mesoamerica. So when the Spanish showed up in the city of Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the Aztec world, they noticed that Moctezuma had all of these. He had a lot of deformed people around him. So he had hunchback people. He had very grotesque looking people with all kind of deformities in his palace sitting around him. And we think that rather than, in the Western world, people with deformities are kind of looked down upon, they thought that, and we see it in the Maya world too, even with dwarfs, anybody who has some kind of deformity, they think that they were touched by the gods, that there's something special about them, and that they need to be protected and looked after. And so, yeah, even Moctezuma, one of the most, vicious emperors in all of the ancient world, who, enslaved so much of Mesoamerica, he took care of and cherished people with deformities, and they lived in his palace next to him. They sat next to his throne. So it's kind of one of those things I'm saying, when you're studying the ancient world, whatever you think makes sense in your brain, just throw it out, because you're studying people who may as well have lived on Mars. So another thing to recognize is that the stela that we see on the right, very similar to Göbekli Tepe, which I think that is mostly limestone. Is that right?
Mhm.
So in the Olmec world, people don't really realize this. In the Olmec world, they're using a rock that's even harder than limestone, much harder than limestone, which is basalt. And so, like in Göbekli Tepe, how they're pulling the surface of the limestone stele away to reveal
Yeah, it's
carvings.
in relief, which is hard, yeah.
Exactly. The Olmecs are doing the same thing on basalt. So
Wow.
you're talking about, and what's interesting is, similar to Göbekli Tepe, I mean, we know of sites that are older than Göbekli Tepe, and you kind of see an increase in sophistication, just very, very slightly, in ancient Turkey. In the Olmec world, we don't see an increase. We don't see it kind of ramp up. It just begins exactly with what you're looking at. All
Yeah,
of
it
the monuments I've been showing, they are doing this according to the archaeological record. There's probably a lot that's left out. There's probably a lot that hasn't been discovered. But according to the archaeological record, it just begins like this. And it's even more true for when people who study ancient Egypt, they often say, well, they started building pyramids right at the beginning. Well, no, I mean, there's regardless of what you think, there's thousands of years of, I say that, well, thousands, but definitely hundreds of years of documented history before they even get to the pyramids. There's a little ramp up, and then it starts moving really fast, and they start building the pyramids. And according to my beliefs, they have this time of monumental architecture that's at a scientific height that then falls off, and it's never achieved again. But there's a little bit of a buildup before they get to the pyramids. But here it is right from the very beginning. They're making Olmec heads. They have these giant monuments. They have a writing system. There's nothing really that comes before this. So, all right, oldest pyramid in Mesoamerica.
Whoa.
So the only, well, I guess we will. I will address that. This is the oldest pyramid in Mesoamerica. It is 110 feet in height, and it is 200,000 tons of fill. Originally thought to represent perhaps, there's lots of volcanoes in the Olmec area. There's actually a volcano that's going to go off like any day now and just completely eviscerate the city that lives right next to it, and the people just decide not to move. It's so it's a site called Caverns. Anybody could just Google this. I was at a site called Caverns, standing on top of a pyramid, looking at a giant volcano, and there's smoke coming out of the volcano, filling up the entire sky. And they're like, yeah, it's going to blow any day now, and it's going to be just going to level the whole city next to it. And I'm like, and there are people living in that whole city, and they're like, yep, they refuse to move. So probably in our lifetime, there's a giant volcano that's going to go off in the Olmec world and kill hundreds of thousands of people. So anyways, it's originally thought to have been a mountain or a volcano, but it's proven to have 4 sides prior to abandonment when they've done some excavations. So it's not a volcano. It is a true pyramid. And the only older pyramid is found at Poverty Point, which is in Louisiana, I believe. And that Poverty Point is dated to be about 9,000 years old. It's either 9,000 or 9,000 BC. So
It's BC Poverty Point.
Is it really 9,000 BC?
I don't know if it's BC. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think.
Google.
I'm just not sure if it's 9,000 years ago or 9,000 years BC.
Well, it's saying it's 3,400 years ago, so maybe it's 900 BC. Wait, let's have a look.
Oh, really? Really?
Poverty Point, indigenous people between 1700 and 1100 BC. So
1100 BC. Isn't there a 9,000? John.
Oh,
John's watching this. John lives in Louisiana. I knew you'd leave a comment. John, what is the name of the site in Louisiana that is like 11,000 or 9,000 years old? There's a mound that's there, and I thought it was Poverty Point, or maybe it's that the first evidence of habitation that we have at Poverty Point goes back to
because the site of Stonehenge, so like they kind of date Stonehenge to 2000, say 2500 BC ish. It's pre-pyramid, so a bit older than that. But then they found evidence of people living and using the site from 7000 BC. So the site is super old, and people were obviously drawn and using the site for thousands of years before they put the stone stuff there, and then they put wooden buildings and structures there for thousands of years before they put the stone one. So it's always older.
But even so, Poverty Point is still
mega old.
Yeah, still the only older.
I think
pyramid.
Graham Hancock thinks Poverty Point's like even older. I think that's what he's arguing for. So who knows?
Well, there's probably ancient dates that I'm sure many of the cities in the Americas have been inhabited for 30,000 years. They used to think it was 12 to 15,000 years ago people were coming into the Americas. Now they're pushing it back to 30,000. And then now there's evidence that it's like 150,000 years ago. So, who knows? Who knows how old everything really is? Let's see. Mysterious Mountains. What's up, man? This guy has a great page, and he knows a lot about ancient, what would be considered modern day United States. Okay, so let's continue. So colossal heads. So there's 17 known colossal heads. However,
17 big boys.
however, those are 17 basalt heads. Dr. Barnhart and I, this hasn't come out yet. I'm waiting to make a video to publish this. Dr. Barnhart and I, in a private collection that I was able to get photos of, found 3 more. I say we found them, but it felt like we found them because I'd never seen them on the internet before. We found 3 more limestone Olmec heads that are about twice as big as all the heads that we saw. Couldn't even believe it. We walked into this room. They were like these metal sheds where they were keeping Olmec artifacts out of the rain, essentially. And so we met up with a couple of archaeologists from ENA who let us in, and it was this insanely obscure little museum that couldn't even be called a museum. I mean, we paid just pennies to go in there, and there's a little logbook. And so we would make a joke every time we would go in. We're looking at some of the world's greatest artifacts and monuments, some of the ancient world's greatest artifacts and monuments that come from one of the fertile crescents of the ancient world. And the logbook says that the last person that was here was 4 weeks ago. Just,
whoa.
Yeah, it was amazing. And then before that, it was 4 weeks before that, so these are very obscure sites. I was, fortunate to go and got photos of everything, and everybody watching will eventually see these. But we walk into this metal building, and we walk in, and there's 1, 2, 3 giant limestone Olmec heads that are twice as tall as any of the other basalt heads. And we look at each other, and we're both like, what is this? Not even a guy who's been a Mesoamerican archaeologist for 35 years, has never seen these before. And so it really, really cool. And so there's definitely more than 17. And now that we know that there's limestone Olmec heads, who knows? But they were really, really badly eroded. You almost couldn't even tell the features anymore. You had to see it from a certain light to be able to. We turned off some of the lights to be able to see it from different angles, and you could still make out some of the features. But they're believed to be unique portraits of Olmec rulers, although almost certainly not all rulers had colossal heads commissioned, because this is a 2,500 year long civilization here, or about 2,500 years, around 2,000 years. And so, there would have been definitely more than 17 rulers. So there's definitely more out there to be discovered, although probably not all of them had their own heads. And the size of the head may indicate what the king, how powerful the kingdom was at the time, and how much basalt they could actually commission to be pulled, to have their giant head made. So all of them measure between 4 feet 10 inches tall and 12 feet tall, and weigh between 6 to 40 tons. But that 40 would actually go up to 42 for the La Cobata head that we'll get to. And they're found at all 3 major Olmec sites, which is San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. And many have markings on their heads as though they were intentionally damaged. You can see that on the top right. Looks like these scars that are going down the top of their heads.
Yeah.
Although it's also theorized that it is accidental damage during carving. So they're carving it away, and then boom, they hit a big chip through. But
damn it, Brad.
Yeah, but
You've ruined the piece.
Dr. Barnhart and a lot of academics don't think that's the case. They don't really know what it is. They don't think that it's another culture trying to come and deface the heads, because you would see it on the face. They wouldn't be carving away at it from the top of the head.
I feel like, go with me, that maybe it became, because how in statues today, it becomes lucky to touch a certain part of it. So these old statues, like these kind of bronze statues, are all like green and gray, and then they've got like one gold shoulder where everybody goes and gives it a rub. It could have been that like later times it became like lucky to sharpen your knife on an Olmec god's head, and it would bless your knife or whatever. So I'm just sort of have the idea of people, it becomes like a weird tradition like we do. We rub the statue of the dog on the nose, and then the nose becomes worn away after years and years and years. Maybe there was some sort of like lucky little thing where people would be like, I will bless my battle sword with the Olmec head, and give it a little swipe or whatever. Because it looks like it looks like stone sharpening tool marks or animal horns when they. So that's why I immediately thought like maybe it was a thing. Interesting to note, because you said there was 17 Olmec kings they're supposed to be, but they all the facials, it looks all very similar in the same way that all of the different pharaoh faces across Egypt are all supposed to be different pharaohs, yet they all look, apart from Akhenaten, they all look exactly the same. Like
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
carbon copied, buff, really, really blank face
yeah.
stare. Like none of them are smiling. Come on, guys, little smile.
There's
Little
actually
smile.
there's actually one guy who's happy. There's one
Okay,
little
one happy
Olmec guy
king.
that's smiling. When you get all 17 of them together on a photo, that they've got some diagrams, you can then start to see the differences, and it then becomes clear, like, oh, okay, that's a different guy. That's a different guy. But another thing to think
They
is
look like babies. They proportion wise, it looks they look really infantile. Like
they have extremely soft features,
it
very
looks like
round.
little, but even just like the way that the eyes are really big for the face,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
way
Oh,
that
yeah.
baby's eyes are human. Well, obviously they're human size, everyone, but baby's eyes come out like
Mhm.
adult size, and that's why they're so ridiculously big. And then everything else grows around the eyes. It's a similar, like these eyes are sort of almost way too big.
Well, that's interesting because they do have a fascination, almost an obsession with babies in the Olmec world. There are hundreds, probably thousands of jade statues of babies, and
Oh, nonsense, all of them.
on top of that, um, on top of that, I met an Olmec man while I was there. A guy who, I mean, he was just so obviously an Olmec person. He opens up this museum. It was another museum that we went to that nobody had been to in months. And we knock on the door, opens it up, and standing in front of me is an Olmec. And he's got the head. He's got the big, round, chubby head with the big lips and the big nose and the big eyes. And I was like, whoa, okay, here you are. There's a real Olmec standing right in front of me. But Olmec people in Veracruz have strangely different genetics than the rest of Mexico. One thing you don't realize before you start driving around Mexico, so when you go from the Yucatan down into Veracruz to Mexico City, is that Mexicans look vastly different everywhere you go. And I just, being from Texas, I interact with Mexicans who live, close to Texas, either in Texas or somewhere along the border. They look differently than Mexican people that you meet in the Yucatan. And then when you drive from the Yucatan to Veracruz, they look different again. And so in ancient times, you would have had a lot of homogeny in your culture. Everybody would have had basically the same DNA. They would have all looked super similar. This is before you have every single culture on the earth all melding together, and now everyone looks so different. Back then they would have all looked the same. Like if you go to there's a Western Mexico museum at the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, and if you go to the Western Mexico Museum where you look at the terracotta little statues that they make, every single person looks exactly the same because they must have all looked the same. They have these really sharp cheekbones. I don't know if I could pull up a picture of like a modern day Mexican person, you would say, oh, I've seen people that look just like that. And you see that all across Mexico. Anyways, I'm going down a whole rabbit hole. So these are also transported 80 to 90 kilometers away from the Tuxtla Mountains. And how these are transported, we'll get into, but it's a whole can of worms. So this is the largest head, the La Cobada head. It's 12 feet tall and 40 to about 42 tons. But you got to think, how much extra space was on this head before they carved it away? Because
it would have been a square. Yeah, a big old square.
Yeah, originally it was a big square or just a gigantic chunk. We don't even know. I mean, they could have been moving blocks that they carved two heads out of. We just don't have that evidence anymore.
Are they 100% made to be just heads? It's not a case of like they originally were on bodies and chopped off and repurposed anyway.
We haven't found anything that would be a body.
Have you tried looking in the ground?
Could you imagine? Oh, another thing is that these heads are found. So most Olmec artifacts are about 6 to 12 feet under the ground. And when we were at the site of San Lorenzo is a Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is where civilization emerged, sprouted out of nothing. San Lorenzo is one of the fertile crescents of the ancient world as well. And so we're standing there and it's just farmland. And you can kind of see these ancient 3,000 to 4,000 year old temples sitting underneath the grass out there. But there's no monuments out there anymore. They've moved them all to protect them, and make money off of them. So we were talking to a local Olmec man who lived in the area that's been on archaeological digs at that site since he was 16 years old, and he said that there were heads there that were found 60 feet under the ground. And Dr. Barnhart goes, "Hold on, 6 feet under the ground?" And the guy's like, "No, 60." And of course,
60 feet.
he's speaking in Spanish. And he's like 60. He's like 6 feet, and he goes, "No, 60." 16 feet? No, 60.
60.
And Dr. Barnhart's like,
No, that's
how is
that's
how
not-
is that possible? So I don't know. That's mystery. That's something we're gonna go back. We're gonna go back to San Lorenzo in December and reinvestigate that in particular. But yeah, 60 feet under the ground. That's either these are unimaginably old or they're being purposefully buried that deep. And I don't know. I mean, these were dug up. These were dug up at least 100 years ago, around 100 years ago. And so, you can't go back and then you can't repeat the process of digging it up to see how old, the soil was, or how, study the stratigraphy layers of the soil and try to diagnose if it was buried or if this is natural.
If you think about it, we have our entire view of human history, all of our studies, all of our numbers, everything comes from actually a very small layer of the surface of the earth and nothing really underwater, because we haven't really looked under the water for a lot of stuff. So we've everything that we're gonna know is kind of from, I'd say like the first 100 feet. I'm just imagining, like, if these heads are popping up 60 feet underground in some areas, like, what if at 120? Do you know what I mean? Like, why not 60? It's ridiculous. There's granite that is found 60 feet under the front of the Sphinx.
Oh, yeah, wow.
They drilled down outside the front of the Sphinx. There's like the Sphinx temple and the whole sort of promenade that comes up to it. And they were drilling down, trying to do, I think they were trying to check the water table around the Sphinx for protection and whatever. And they drilled right down, and then they smashed their blades for the drill bit, because they hit granite block, and granite is not like indigenous to Giza. They have to get it all the way from Aswan and take it that like 600 miles or something crazy. So the fact that there is either a granite structure or granite blocks, or there is something granite that is 60 feet under the front of the Sphinx and the front of the Sphinx temple. So that always makes me think, like, we've got all of our information from what we can dig up from pretty much, it's such a teeny bit of the Earth's surface. And if we were able to, like, if they could invent some sort of real super rock scanner that could scan 500 feet all over the world, what we would
I'm
find.
sure that's going to be invented sometime soon. There's no
I will
way.
invent it somehow.
Yeah. There's no way that something like that won't be invented, where they can just scan through and see all the different stones that are under the ground. That's got to be like the next.
They got to be, but it's just like, it's all going to come out. It's all going to come out the deeper that we go.
All right, so getting to the enigmas, and we'll just kind of dive into this a little bit. We're going to keep these episodes pretty concise, but we're going to dive into some of the mysteries of the Olmec heads before we answer some questions and bring it to a close here soon. But this is one of my favorite things in the Olmec world, is the lost sarcophagus. So I love sarcophagi. I think they're super, super cool. They tell us a lot about the ancient world. If a place really, or if an artifact really is a sarcophagus, it tells you a lot about the people of that culture, and of course, of the prominent ruler who was buried in it, or maybe a priest, somebody who was high ranking. But so this was discovered by Matthew Sterling in 1939, and it's a low relief depiction of a reptilian dragon body kind of along the sides, and it was filled with jade offerings, red clay, and cinnabar, but there was no body in it. And so there's no way that this was buried with a body inside of it. And over the last 3,500 years, the body decays completely. They're like to the point that there's not even bones left in it. That
No, there'd be forensic evidence of burials.
there would be forensic evidence of organic matter that once existed, or human organic matter that once existed inside the sarcophagus, but they didn't find that. They found jade offerings, red clay, and cinnabar filled to the brim. No body inside whatsoever, which is absolutely bizarre for something that seems like it is so obviously a sarcophagus.
Well, maybe it was a treasure. It was a treasure chest.
Well, the thing is, these
Trunk.
are also. This isn't the only one that was found, but these are also found inside those stone column tombs. So or that at least that stone column box looking thing. This little sarcophagus will be found in there, laid on top of a basalt or a limestone bed. Essentially, I call it a bed, but it's just like a slab, and it's laid on top of that. And so it looks exactly like a tomb. They go in, open it up, nobody. Just bizarre. And it's made of sandstone. And so the sandstone in general does not last that long. And why they made it out of sandstone, I have no idea, because they could have easily made this out of basalt. But the force that it took to lift this sandstone sarcophagus crumbled it in half. They picked it up and then they broke it in half. And, it's kind of like a domino effect. It just goes and just turns into a pile of dust. And this would have been one of the most amazing artifacts to come out of the Olmec world. And for whatever reason, it was made out of sandstone. I'm sure there has to be others that are made out of basalt. But this is a huge, huge mystery. This is a basalt depiction. So you can see how close. I mean, why not just finish the thing on the right and make that a sarcophagus if that's what it's doing? Because it's depicting a quote unquote sarcophagus with a person in it. This person may be a dwarf. We don't really know. Because, like I was saying earlier, they venerated people with quote unquote deformities. So we don't really know if this was dwarf or not, or if whoever just carved this just didn't have the best idea of human proportions. But
he's a little bit stout, but I like his skirt. I like his hat. I like his vibe.
A little bit. Hey, how Indian does this look to you? Like if I told you that this came from ancient India.
Oh yeah, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. It's got the earrings.
The sarcophagus one looks to me instantly. I thought like Chinese, Chinese dragon, and the other one, Indian. Yeah,
it's. I can't explain it. I don't know. It's just one of the many mysteries. Another thing that makes Mesoamerica very similar to ancient Indian and ancient Asian cultures is that we think this is kind of the front edge of archaeology in Mesoamerica, but we think that a part of their religion was appreciating sacred geometry. And so it's just, what are the odds that they have that in common with ancient Indian, Cambodian, other various ancient Asian cultures? They have very similar genes because Native Americans came from Asia. So they have very similar genes, but their monumental architecture looks similar. Their carving looks similar. Their statues look similar. And their religions both venerate sacred geometry, which is just, I don't know. That in itself is a whole mystery. So here we go again. Thrones, altars, or both. There are a lot of times thought that there are altars that people will go up and worship in front of, but then it's possible that the king is sitting on top of it as well. So you look at it to the left, it looks again like these very short, stout people are holding up a throne that you can imagine a king would be sitting on top of. But then in the middle, you have what is a depiction that's found on an altar of a shaman basically emerging from a portal or from a cave, carrying a were-jaguar child. We'll show a lot more photos, but you can see he's got the cleft lips as well. He's got the feline lips, extremely Asian-looking eyes. Of course, Native Americans are Asian. And then he's got the long, elongated hat as well that kind of bends over on the front, perhaps like
a little gnome hat, like a little garden gnome's hat.
You can imagine that underneath that hat is a very long skull as well. And I'll have a lot more examples. And then on the right,
a little bit like the Upper Egypt hat as well.
Yeah. The Hedjet, is that right?
I just know it's the Upper Egypt
Yeah,
hat,
yeah.
but it's like the cone hat that was the two hats that they put together when they
Yes,
united both
exactly,
sides of Egypt.
exactly
But it
right.
looks like the Upper Egypt, Northern Egypt hat.
And then you can see on the right, this is a miniature depiction of a throne. So it's about this big. For anybody looking, it's like maybe 2.5 feet tall by a couple feet wide. And
Like a
so
tiny potty.
you can see this is an altar / throne with somebody sitting up on it. So we see these little clues coming together. And so we're beginning to realize, okay, it's not a throne or an altar. They're both. It's together. And that is so Mesoamerican. You know, when you look at something from our Western Greek and Roman thought, we look at it and we're like, okay, it's either one thing or the other. No, in the Mesoamerican world, it's all of it. It just
Wait, go on. Sorry, just the thrones, right? The thrones on the far side, the one that looks like a big table with babies holding it up. But
yes,
then you
yes.
look and it's like they're Olmec heads. And I said the Olmec heads look like babies. Now I can see the head on what would have had a body. It's babies. It's baby bodies.
Yes, they
That's a
look
babies.
like
They're
they look
babies.
like babies.
I've cracked it. All the heads are babies.
Tell you what, I actually don't think I have this in this presentation because there's so many things, but I am going to pull up some Olmec babies, and we're gonna.
That's 100% Olmec helmeted heads, but they've got baby bodies, and the babies are holding up the throne building thing.
Okay, can everybody see? Yeah, here we go. Olmec babies.
They are creepy looking babies. Oh my gosh.
How bizarre is that?
That's a hench baby. That baby's gonna swing.
Look at that.
Whoa.
How strange is that?
That looks like an old man baby. But again, maybe society was built. Okay, that's really creepy. This is the stuff of nightmares. I'm gonna be having nightmares about Olmec babies now.
So here's the thing. All right, this is the wildest thing, and then we'll probably draw to a conclusion
Come into land
and answer some questions here at the end, because there's so much more to go. We'll have to do like multiple episodes of Olmec stuff.
Yeah.
So this is the craziest thing that I'm working on right now. So for anybody who's been keeping up with me, I'm writing a book right now called The Olmec Enigma, and it is derivative of a very famous chapter from a very famous book. This is the artwork that was finalized recently.
Oh, nice.
The Olmec Enigma.
Sneak peek.
That's a sneak peek. I don't know. I have no idea when the book is going to come out. Probably early 2025. I'm working on a chapter right now about the possibility of Olmec people venerating children with ectodermal dysplasia. So I think it's tangentially connected to Down syndrome. And so when the Spanish show up and they show up to Moctezuma's temple, so this is the Aztecs. This is 2,500, 2,000, 3,000 years after the time of the Olmecs. They show up to Moctezuma's palace temple and they walk in, and he's got hunchbacks. He has people with deformities, missing limbs. He has people with what we now would know as Down syndrome, and all around him. And Mesoamericans, rather than looking down on people with deformities, they took care of him, and they thought that they were special beings that were touched by the gods, and that they may have been clairvoyant of sometimes. You know how when you speak to people who have some kind of deformity or some kind of mental handicap, sometimes they see and think about things in a way that you don't normally see and think about things. Have you ever noticed this before? That people, I'll just be straight. Like, I'll speak to people when I was younger, and I, going to public school, I was around people with Down syndrome a lot more than I am today. And they're extremely sweet and intelligent in a way that's different than our intelligence. They are recognizing things that's different than what we see. And so it's thought that ancient Mesoamericans thought that these people were touched by the gods, and there's something special about them, and they took care of them. And so we think that these babies may be representing people with ectodermal dysplasia, because when you look at some of these depictions, they have, I'll go back to this one. You see these two teeth coming down right here? That is something that is found all the time in ectodermal dysplasia. And I'm displaying a photo right here.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And so we think that they were venerating people with deformities.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, because if they revered infancy and babies and youth and like very young people. People with Down syndrome. My foster sister has Down syndrome, and who I grew up with, and they're people who are fully adults, yet they retain a very youth-like quality, the youth honesty, the frankness. Like she will call, my sister would call things out that maybe most adults would socially feel like that they weren't able to say. She just see it as it is. I get what you mean by like intense honesty, intense frankness, the observing things. I could see how a society who like to worship babies would also see people with special needs as like having kept this like magical quality of youth and infancy up even when they were adults. Small people,
Yep. Yeah.
childlike minded people.
Yeah. It's of course, this is all completely speculation. I have a whole chapter kind of covering these different things because, okay, so in the Olmec world, we see these babies that have this sort of quality with these two little fangs that are indicative of ectodermal dysplasia. But then we also see were-jaguar depictions like this, which seem to be something separate from that. You have these people that are half jaguar, half were-jaguar. So, okay, we have babies. We have were-jaguar adults and children. We have shamans with cleft lips. We have giant Olmec heads that look, like normal people. And then you also have statues that look like, your typical average Veracruz Olmec person. We have all these different depictions of these different types of people, in different conditions and different ages. It's just completely a bizarre culture. And so I have a chapter in there where I'm sort of hypothesizing different explanations of what this could mean. I mean, this is very obviously a baby. Babies have their fingers in their mouths. And then look at him. He's wearing that Olmec helmet that you
safety helmet. It's a special needs helmet.
Well, who knows? I mean, but that's another thing.
A safety helmet.
I've presented this idea to people before about the Olmecs potentially venerating children and people with Down syndrome or deformities, and the immediate response that I've gotten from almost all of them is, dude, there's no way that they would do that. That's way too far out there. And I'm like, man, we're basically studying Martians here. They are not anything like us at all. What we think is, our typical paths of thought and logic is just completely different. Just throw it out the window, because as long as you hold on to that, you won't even come close to understanding these people. It's completely different. So,
well, modern day India, they even like today, when children get born with like extra limbs, and they think, oh my goodness, I've given birth to a god. Like it's actually quite a common trait, I think, for like human. If you really believe in deities and someone's born with something unique that you can relate to a deity or something, yeah, it makes sense.
You see, here's that same kind of helmet that's on this guy here.
Yep.
Oh, here's the smiling head.
Oh, he's the happy one. He's my favorite.
This is like the only guy in all of Mesoamerica who's smiling.
Say cheese.
I'm not even kidding. I'm not even kidding. You have 5,000 years of history and stonework and carvings and depictions of people. This is the only happy guy in Mesoamerica. So it must have been a violent, like macabre, very serious place. Let's see what else we got here. Look at this. Look how strange this is.
Oh wow, I've got to come right up close to that. That's a weird little nose, a little goblin nose.
Yeah, well, they think it's the mouth and the lips of a jaguar with the fangs there as well.
He was
so
a hybrid.
It's yes, well, that's what it is. It's a were-jaguar, and he also has a cleft in the top of his head as well. So it's like a different form of people. And the problem here is, just kind of wrapping this up, the problem with the Olmecs is there is a separation from the height of Olmec culture into the Maya. So usually we have like things that we have cultures ending that spill into new cultures, and we're able to kind of trace that cultural heritage back and answer some questions. The Olmecs begin with monuments like this. They begin a fully fledged, fully organized society with artwork, stone artwork like this.
Just bam, out of nowhere.
Bam, out of nowhere. and then they disappear for a reason that we don't really know. And then several hundred years later, the Maya begin their ascent. And the Maya, while inspired by the Olmecs, like, we often call the Olmecs the mother culture, and in some ways that's true. But in some ways, the Olmecs are just an isolated culture that rises and then falls before the rest of Mesoamerica even begins. So we don't have any connection to the Olmecs. You couldn't go and ask the Aztecs or the Maya in 1519 when Cortez shows up on the beaches of Mexico. He couldn't go and ask people questions about the Olmecs because they're completely disconnected from them. We don't have anybody that can answer these questions. Wow, this one is definitely going to ruffle some feathers. If you're new to my channel, I'm Luke Caverns. I'm an anthropologist with a hard focus on ancient civilizations. And this is a brand new series where I will be willingly tossing myself into the flames of historical revisionist hell. Try to say that 5 times fast. You can call this debunking, or you can call it just clarifying, but there's a lot of junk out there when it comes to ancient history. And I take a particular offense to people who try to rewrite it. Now, I'm not talking general enthusiasts or YouTubers who are theorizing on how the Egyptians built the pyramids or how they moved these 1,000+ ton monuments. I'm talking about people who are deliberately rewriting our ancient past to try to appease some modern agenda, or more likely line their own pockets, or even just simply popular ancient mysteries or topics that have to do with ancient history that are purposely misconstrued to mislead people to line their own pockets. And so without any further ado, it's with great displeasure that I subject you all and myself to this brand new series called Historical. So in 1862, a man named Jose Maria Selgar y Serrano made the very first discovery of an Olmec head at the ancient site of Tres Zapotes, Mexico. And over the next several decades, well into the early 1900s, different historians, antiquarians, and early archaeologists would theorize and debate over who exactly built this monument, where it came from, and what culture is responsible for these ancient heads that keep popping up all over the place. The initial impressions of some archaeologists who first saw these heads, they thought that these heads must be indicating people of African descent with their prominent brows, flaring noses, and big lips. And this idea was propelled throughout the 20th century through authors like Leo Wiener, which is an unfortunate last name, with his book Africa and the Discovery of the Americas, as well as R.A.J.'s book The Ancient Egyptians in the Americas, and of course the famous book that was published in 1976, Ivan van Sertima's book They Came Before Columbus. The main idea and theory and overarching theme of all of these books is that at some point during the height of Olmec civilization, roughly between 800 BC and 600 BC, there was a great hypothetical African civilization that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, found its way roughly into the Gulf of Mexico, around the area of Veracruz, Mexico, and that these African civilizations gave birth to culture and civilization in Mesoamerica, and then, according to some theories, spawned civilization all across the Americas from there. It probably doesn't surprise you that the vast majority of this research is based on very, 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 very far-reaching parallels and trying to draw connections between cultures that have basically nothing in common. And I wish that I could tell you that the evidence that they have is based on anything more than, well, this sort of looks like, or, this kind of looks like. There's very little evidence to any of this at all. Now, the purpose of these theories, at the very least in Ivan van Sertima's case, is to reattribute the great feats of at least Mesoamerican Native Americans, but maybe Native Americans all across the Americas, reattributing their feats to an African culture, a hypothetical African culture, which may or may not be the Moors or the Mali Empire or the Egyptians. And really going one step further than that, it is reiterated all throughout his book and even on the front cover that this book is actually, and this whole theory is actually not really about trying to reattribute feats away from other cultures and give more feats to an African culture, but really it's trying to give feats to ancient people who had black skin. and further reattributing feats and monuments to Black history. We will revisit this concept continuously throughout this episode, but this idea of focusing on skin color is really a post-colonial, post-1500 concept. There is no evidence at all in the ancient world that prejudices were based on skin color. More likely, they were based on tribalism and your ancestors and culturalism. You bought into the main culture, and if you weren't a part of that, you were seen as lesser or barbaric. Nowhere in the ancient world can we find any evidence of people having prejudices against each other based on skin color. That is, as far as we know, really only something that exists within the last 500 years, and he is making a huge mistake as a historian by graphing all ancient people with this concept as though skin color was important in the ancient world. This entire approach is just not the approach that any serious historian would ever take. And that's really a huge problem in the modern day. A lot of modern people like to look back through history or judge ancient people based on a set of morality and values that exist today, which didn't exist hundreds or even thousands of years ago. And Ivan von Sertima, as well as many other people in the modern world, such as YouTubers or Afrocentrists or ethnocentrists or Eurocentrists, like to follow these ideas and use that to reattribute the feats of Native Americans to other hypothetical cultures. And, this cycle of confirmation bias just continues for decades and decades to now where we are at a point where you have somebody who has millions and millions of followers that is seriously teaching that this ancient Mediterranean god Marduk, after he gets in a battle with his brother, takes the Olmecs from Africa and flies across the Atlantic Ocean to create the whole Teotihuacan Chichen Itza civilization, and those were supposed to be the Olmec people. I'm not kidding. That's almost a direct quote. And all of this evolved from the Olmec heads just looking African. So, do the Olmec heads actually look African? Well, the very first researchers over 150 years ago thought so, and this idea remained pretty popular all the way up to Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, which is actually the first book where I learned about the Olmecs. But Graham Hancock has had the good sense to actually follow the DNA evidence over the last 30 or 40 years, which undoubtedly proves that there is no pre-colonial African DNA in any of the native people that were living in Veracruz. In fact, according to DNA and literary sources, the very first Africans to actually enter what we consider today to be modern-day Veracruz, Mexico, happened in 1570 when a band of African slaves in the Caribbean escaped and then they marooned on the coast of Veracruz. That is the very, very first time that we have solid evidence of Africans arriving in modern-day Veracruz or the Olmec heartland. But getting back to Hancock, since more and more DNA evidence has begun to surface since Graham Hancock's initial mention of the Olmecs, he has now changed his tune to the DNA evidence showing no sign of African DNA in the ancient Olmec people. And, it's hard to argue with DNA analysis. Also, all anybody has to do is just Google what the indigenous people of Veracruz, Mexico actually look like. And you will immediately find an endless supply of photos showing indigenous Veracruz men with these big flared nose, big lips, big faces, and furrowed brows. They look exactly like the Olmec heads. And you might think, well, these Olmec heads don't really look traditionally Native American. But one thing you have to remember is that the Americas cover the other half of the planet that humans have inhabited over the last 10,000 plus years. And it's obviously a vast, vast area with genetics that are not exactly homogeneous. There is a very wide diversity of genetic variation within the Americas. And just personally or anecdotally, as I started traveling through Latin America, I very quickly realized that indigenous people did not look the same in southern Mexico or in Peru as they do in Texas or in the woodlands in the United States. As you travel throughout Latin America, you can see that indigenous people such as the Maya look noticeably and quite different than indigenous people in Peru such as the Inca. And of course, the Olmecs are no exception. Earlier this year, when I arrived at the Olmec Museum in Tlaxcala, Mexico, I waited for this guy to open up the door. He opens up the door, and I'm staring at the chest of this huge indigenous Veracruz man. I look up, and it is literally an Olmec head with a huge face, a flared nose, big lips, a furrowed brow. It was a living, breathing Olmec head sitting on top of this man's body. I was looking at the descendant of the Olmecs. And this is something that everybody can do. And so I end up wondering, well, why exactly do we need to pull in the potential influence of the Moors or the Mali Empire or some hypothetical African civilization or even the Egyptians, which the Egyptians play a huge part in Ivan van Sertima's book, where he hypothesizes that the Africans are actually the origins of Olmec civilization. And Egypt also plays a huge role in this entire theory as a whole. There's even an entire chapter in his book where he tries to draw cultural parallels between ancient Egypt, which mostly it's just ancient Egypt. He doesn't really talk too much about other African cultures in this chapter, but he tries to draw these parallels between ancient Egypt and the Olmec world. So, are there any cultural parallels between Egypt and the Olmec world? Well, you'll be happy to know that I forced myself to read through Sertima's chapter on African-Egyptian presence in the ancient Americas. And I was quite disappointed, but not really surprised, that all that I found were these very long, fluffy descriptions of ancient Egyptian culture and Olmec culture, tying no real connections to one another at all, other than the possibility that the written Olmec solar calendar may have been born during the time of Egypt's 25th dynasty, which of course is the time when the Nubians, who were living in the south of Egypt, that have traditionally been depicted as black skin, marched forward during a time of tribulation in Egypt, conquered Egypt, and reigned in Egypt for a little bit over a century. He theorizes that it's during this time that Egypt actually colonized Mexico. And then he also brings in the fact that there are architectural similarities between ancient Egypt, the city of Lixus, Morocco, and Peru, which Peru kind of came out of nowhere in the book. I don't know if he was insinuating that Africans also colonized Peru, or that their colonization of ancient Mexico and them being responsible for civilization in Mexico also had a domino effect on the rest of the Americas, from Mexico all the way down to South America. And it's because of this hypothetical African civilization that the megalithic stonework in Peru was built. He also used the ancient site of Lixus, Morocco, as an example of ancient architecture that was also constructed during the time period of the Nubian dynasty in Egypt. But Lixus, Morocco was built by Phoenicians who settled in North Africa, and the Phoenicians are Semitic people that would eventually go on to found Carthage. Those were not native Africans that built that city. So now we're at a point where we are reattributing the feats of not only the Olmecs, but also ancient Peruvians, such as the Inca, or maybe a pre-Inca civilization that built those megalithic stones. And now we're reattributing Phoenician and Semitic feats to this hypothetical lost African culture. Well, we're certainly on a roll of historical revisionism here. And as a side note that I will get to, the Phoenicians were actually much, much better sailors than the Egyptians, but that's a whole other thing that we're going to get into in a moment. This actually brings me to another topic that I need to make an episode of Historical about. It drives me insane how theorists in the modern world just kind of change and shift their perceptions on ancient Egyptians to fit whatever narrative they're trying to sell people. The Egyptians couldn't have erected these statues and built these temples or the pyramids. I mean, they're just loincloth wearing, desert dwelling, camel riding, primitive people with primitive tools that couldn't have done any of this. But yet at the same time, those same people will be enthusiastic about the possibility of a lost Egyptian colony having been found in the Grand Canyon back in the 1970s. How is it possible that on one hand we have people who just dismiss all of the capability of the Egyptians to be able to achieve these amazing feats, erecting these giant statues, building pyramids and huge temples, and yet at the same time say that they were also able to circumnavigate the entire globe, find North America, and then settle deep in the Grand Canyon? Also, the Egyptians would never live in the Grand Canyon. Does this look like the Grand Canyon to you? Now, I know that for people who are just amateur enthusiasts that are just interested in these topics, it's just a simple lapse in thinking. I know that. However, that simple lapse in thinking is a tool that some people use and spin and manipulate in order to sell books or videos to people that have absolutely no basis in real ancient history. And I see it every single day that those people use that to create this cycle of confirmation bias that inherently breeds an audience that is more ignorant and less informed than they are. And this leads me to my next point. When this whole topic of the Olmec heads potentially representing some members of this ancient lost black African civilization is also being pushed by the very same people who are so enthusiastic about spreading the idea that ancient Egypt was a black civilization, you can kind of see where this is all coming from. It is a rewriting of our ancient past that reattributes great feats of ancient people from all around the world, not just to a hypothetical African civilization, no, to a hypothetical black civilization. That is inherently wrong. This is graphing modern post-colonial concepts of society onto ancient people as if ancient people had any understanding of this concept or as if it played any factor in their world. We have absolutely no evidence to show that the concept of skin color played an active role in people's life in the Mediterranean or the ancient American world. In the ancient world, you were segregated by culture. Hell, even Alexander the Great and the other people of Macedonia were discriminated against by the greater Greek world for not being Greek enough. Or for instance, in Rome, it didn't really matter what your skin color was or where you came from as long as you could communicate or read and write in Latin or Greek. It was about buying into the culture, and if you weren't a part of the culture, you were seen as other or barbaric. So looking at the ancient world and teaching people about the ancient world through a lens which bases things on people's skin color is either A, intellectually dishonest, or B, it's just completely ignorant of ancient history. But Egypt was never a black civilization. Egypt was never, at any point in its ancient history, ever made up of anything other than Egyptians. And who are Egyptians? Well, they are African, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean, meaning that Egypt was always the ancient world's most diverse civilization, made up of all the people who lived around its boundaries. And for anyone to ever claim that Egypt was actually a black civilization is to totally ignore Egypt's geographical location and the common sense that the fertile Nile Valley would have been a prime location for people all nearby in the ancient world to migrate to, as well as ignoring the DNA evidence that comes from the thousands of bodies that have been found mummified from ancient Egypt that are very easily DNA testable, which all say that they are an amalgamation of all the people from the nearby ancient world. That includes Africans, Middle Eastern people, and Mediterranean people. Now, where in the world does this connect to the Olmec culture? Well, if you read between the lines in Ivan von Sertima's book, you get the idea that even he knows that his insinuation that Egypt was a black civilization is actually false. And why is that? Well, it's because he doesn't attribute any other dynasty or any other time period in ancient Egypt to having been responsible for the Olmec heads other than Egypt's 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty, which were in fact black kings from the land of Nubia just south of Egypt. So even he, if you read between the lines without saying it, is acknowledging the fact that every single other dynasty in Egypt were ruled by and inhabited by Egyptians, and that only during about this roughly a century period of time was Egypt actually ruled by people who us in the modern day would look at and consider them to be black. It's only this time period between about 780 BC and 650 BC that he actually attributes the colonization of the Olmec heartland by the ancient Egyptians, which again points towards the fact that he isn't actually interested in ancient cultures. He's interested in modern skin colors and selling books to people who probably have that same skin color. It is insidious, misleading, and demeaning to tell modern black people that the most important part of their history is the slave trade, which, I mean, hell, it's written on the front cover of the book. And for black history to have any more significance than it already does, you have to erase the feats of ancient Peruvians, ancient Mexicans, ancient Egyptians, and ancient Semitic peoples such as the Phoenicians. Throughout Sertima's book, as well as dozens and dozens of videos that I've seen online, there doesn't really seem to be a timeline consensus among people who believe that the Olmec heads are actually African. And because the entire theory hinges on the idea that the people who discovered ancient Mexico have to be black, not African, but black. This timeline of possible discovery of the Americas gets narrowed down into 2 different time periods. A, the Nubian pharaohs of Egypt's 25th dynasty between 750 and 650 BC set sail all the way towards the western Mediterranean, passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, and slipped into the Atlantic Ocean and, either intentionally or not, discovered ancient America. However, to prove that the Egyptians would have even been able to do this, you would need an archaeological record proving that the Egyptians in previous centuries were actually capable of faring the Mediterranean seas on a large scale, which the Egyptians were not. The Egyptians didn't even have a harbor city on the Mediterranean until about 300 BC, when Alexander the Great and his kingdom of Macedon, the Greeks, conquer Egypt and build the port city of Alexandria. The Egyptians never at any point had any real passion to set out and explore the Mediterranean. They were in the Mediterranean for various trading expeditions, but they were not sailing across the Mediterranean in the way that the Phoenicians or the Greeks were. So it makes no sense for them to be the ones to discover the Americas when they didn't even really have anything more than just river boats or boats that would navigate the Mediterranean just along the coastline. One thing that we have to learn about the ancient Egyptians is that they were isolationists. They did not care about setting sail across the Mediterranean or exploring the deserts. They called the Mediterranean the Great Green, and they were kind of scared of it. And they were definitely scared of the roaming, scary barbarians and marauders in the deserts. They didn't live in the deserts, and they didn't sail across the Mediterranean Sea. They lived on the tropical oasis that exists right along the Nile, and that's the only place they ever wanted to be. Furthermore, if the Egyptians ever did have any business setting sail for the western Mediterranean and passing through the Straits of Gibraltar, they would have to have some kind of relationship with, or they would definitely come in contact with, the Phoenicians, Iberians, or the Celts, of which we have absolutely no archaeological record that the Egyptians were settling in or had anything to do with traveling out to the Strait of Gibraltar. People living out near the Strait of Gibraltar may have traveled to Egypt, but the Egyptians surely did not go to them. That's just the way things worked in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Egyptians didn't come to you, you would have to go to them. As far as the Egyptians were concerned, everything outside of Egypt was a vast, barren waste full of roaming barbarians. And the second idea that I have seen popularized, at least in the last several decades, is this idea that the Moorish people or the people of the Mali Empire are actually responsible for the Olmec heads. And while the Moors and the Mali Empire were an extremely wealthy and extremely advanced civilization that was perfectly capable of navigating the Atlantic Ocean, and they are what we would consider today to be a black civilization, they existed centuries, millennia after the Olmecs had already risen and fallen in the ancient world. Those two timelines don't match up whatsoever. Also, just as another side note, the Moorish people and the Mali people, we have no evidence at all that they would have identified themselves as being black people. In fact, if you could talk to a Moorish or Mali person from that time, if you could time travel there and ask them if they would consider themselves to be a part of a black civilization, they wouldn't really understand what you're asking or understand why their skin color plays any factor in their day-to-day life or who their civilization is or what value their civilization has. Again, these were tribalistic people who cared more about their ancestors and where they come from and their claim to wealth and power, just like everybody else did in the ancient world. Skin color, again, is a post-colonial thing, and it's something that really exists in the Western world where colonial slavery existed. The Moors and the Mali Empire both reached their height sometime between 800 and 1400 AD, which is over 1,000 years after the fall of the Olmecs in the ancient Mesoamerican world. It's also after the rise and fall of the Maya, and it's right around the time that the Aztecs have entered Mesoamerica, and they're just gearing up to prepare to launch their empire over Mesoamerica. So even though it is possible that the Moors or the Mali Empire may have actually discovered the Americas prior to Columbus, just like Columbus, they were late arrivers to the party. The party had already begun and was well on its way by the time Columbus arrived, and would have been by the time the Mali Empire or the Moorish people arrived as well. And they certainly are not responsible for kicking off ancient American civilization. Okay, so is there any evidence at all that ancient people from Africa actually stumbled their way into the Americas prior to the arrival of Columbus? Well, there may be some linguistic evidence in the Caribbean. When the first Spaniards arrived, they were doing their best to communicate with the local indigenous people. The Spaniards noticed that the Taino people had these long spears with these metal alloy tips, and they asked them, where did you get this metal alloy? Because you have to keep in mind, the Spaniards are looking for gold and silver, wealth to send back to Spain, something to justify the cost of these extremely expensive expeditions. And the Taino people told them that a dark-skinned sailing tribe of people somewhere in the southeast of the Caribbean of where they were arrived and gave them these metals, and they called it guanin or guanine. We never really hear anything more of these dark-skinned tribal people, but it turns out that there may be some evidence that in the area of the coast of West Africa, that same metal alloy has a very similar name of guanin or guanine. That may be a linguistic connection across the Atlantic Ocean, but that's about all the evidence that we have. We haven't found a boat. We haven't found inscriptions of ancient people from Africa, which is another thing. If the Egyptians colonized ancient Mexico and they were erecting and carving these huge heads that also have solar calendars that are, roughly hieroglyphs, why do we not see Egyptian hieroglyphs? Why do we not see ancient African inscriptions in the Olmec world? Why are all the Olmec inscriptions only unique to this land? The evidence just shows that there's no connection across the ocean here, no notable connection. Now, the other possibility is that Phoenician people who were sailing on expeditions sometime in the early first millennia BC, they were sending these expeditions all the way around the coast of Africa. And this may coincide with the height of the ancient Olmec city of Levinta. There's this really strange monument there called Monument 13, and it shows this man holding a flag, and he's got what looks like a turban. He has a short mustache with a beard, and he's wearing these pointed shoes. He doesn't look traditionally Native American whatsoever. Native Americans didn't have turbans, and they definitely didn't carry flags. Actually, one of the first places in the ancient world that we see flags is along the Nile, where you would have these riverboats going up and down the Nile, and you'd have this pole with a flag on top of it that says what village you came from. That's where flags began, and they spread out through the Mediterranean world. So it looks like a man who is Phoenician on this Olmec monument. And what may have happened is that these Phoenician expeditions that are sailing around the coast of Africa, one of them may have gotten caught on a current and pulled all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and became marooned in the Olmec heartland in what we consider today to be modern-day Veracruz, Mexico. And it's possible that an ancient Phoenician visitor, which modern-day scholars actually call this Monument 13 the Traveler due to the inscriptions that are seen just off to the side of it. It's possible that an ancient person from the Mediterranean actually became a cameo on an Olmec monument, but it does not mean that those ancient visitors actually spawned Olmec civilization. There's a difference there. All that said, even without being able to prove cross-continental connections between the Americas and Africa, is it possible that ancient African people actually discovered the Americas prior to Columbus' arrival in 1492? Well, of course it is. In fact, I think it would actually be stupid to dismiss the likelihood that other cultures from around the world discovered the Americas before Columbus. The Vikings, Phoenicians, Africans, possibly the Chinese, they could have all marooned and accidentally discovered the Americas. Now, whether or not they survived long enough to actually influence local culture is very dubious, because if they weren't just dead on arrival from being at sea for who knows how long before they accidentally discovered the Americas, they could have just as easily died from disease after they arrived or been killed as soon as they arrived too. And the only reason that this wasn't the case with later on Europeans who would colonize the Americas was because world civilization was finally ready for a global economy on that scale in a way that the world never was in centuries prior to that. All in all, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that any culture of the ancient world other than the Olmecs are directly responsible for Olmec civilization. The Egyptians, other than for one dynasty, never colonized anything outside of Egypt ever. They were complete isolationists that had no interest in living anywhere other than the sacred Nile Valley, which they saw in their worldview to be above the rest of the ancient world, and that was the natural order of things. The Egyptians did not want to leave Egypt. And to reattribute the feats of ancient people to a different culture and through a lens of the modern world that applies more significance to skin color than people of the ancient world actually did is intellectually dishonest. And so with this episode of Historable, I sentence this African Olmec theory to historical revisionist hell.